session of the Portland City Council. Good afternoon, Carla. Could you please call the roll?
Yes, Fritz.
Here.
Hardesty.
Here.
Udaly.
Here.
Wheeler.
Here, we'll now read the first item, please.
Do you want to do the,
No.
okay.
Not at all.
Do you want to give an abridged version? Sure.
Yes,
go
let me
for
do
it.
a really quick abridged version, please. Welcome to the Portland City Council. The City Council represents all Portlanders and meets to do the city's business. The presiding officer preserves order and decorum during city council meetings so everyone can feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe. If you are in the audience and would like to show your support for something that is said, please feel free to do a thumbs up. If you want to express you do not support something, please feel free to do a thumbs down. Please remain seated in council chambers unless entering or exiting. If you are filming the proceedings, please do not use bright lights or disrupt the meeting. Disruptive conduct such as shouting or interrupting testimony or council deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning that will be given that further disruption may result in the person being ejected for the remainder of the meeting. After being ejected, a person who fails to leave the meeting is subject to arrest for trespass. Thank you for helping keep your fellow Portlanders feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe.
Thank you. First item, please.
Item 81, update on the Broadway corridor.
Thank you. The redevelopment of the Broadway corridor represents one of the most significant opportunities to achieve the city's Central City 2035 plan and our city's overall strategic goals. Its location and size hold the potential to manage our city's growth and realize our vision for creating shared economic prosperity in the city of Portland. This project will evolve Portland's landscape. These 34 acres could be a new center of employment, housing, a transit and bike hub, and a connector between Old Town, Chinatown, and the Pearl District. I envision the Broadway corridor as Portland's next great place: vibrant, livable, accessible, affordable, sustainable, and inclusive. In other words, a place where all Portlanders see themselves, and a place where all Portlanders feel welcome, a place where all Portlanders feel that they have a sense of ownership, in a place from which everyone in this community has the opportunity to benefit. As you'll hear this afternoon, the impact of the development will reach across the city and touch residents from every neighborhood, income level, and cultural community. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone from the steering committee and our development advisor, Continuum Partners, to the Healthy Communities Coalition and our city bureaus for working with my office, Prosper Portland, and the Portland Housing Bureau to create the vision before you. It's going to take all of us and many more partners to deliver on this vision over the course of the next 20 years. As we go from vision to implementation, we're going to need to make some difficult, important decisions in order to ensure the project can continue to move forward. I'm confident that with this council's leadership, alongside the commitment of our public, private, and community partners, we can build a new neighborhood that reflects our highest aspirations. And while the focus is all about the development, I want to remind people that at the end of the day, it isn't just about buildings or about public spaces or about infrastructure or even our desire to create a world-class example of sustainability. This is ultimately about people. That's what our community is. It is people, and making sure that this development respects all people in this community. And with that, I will turn this over to Kimberly Brannan from Prosper Portland. Director Brannan, good afternoon.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon. Commissioners, Mayor, I'm Kimberly Branham, Executive Director of Prosper Portland, and I'm joined by Shannon Callahan, Director of the Portland Housing Bureau, Vivian Satterfield with the Healthy Communities Coalition, Mark Falcone, CEO of Continuum Partners, and Lisa Abwaf, Development and Investment Director for Prosper Portland. We are excited to be here with you this afternoon at a pivotal moment for the Broadway Corridor project. We have two goals for you today. The first is to provide council with an overview of the progress that we've made in planning for this transformative development from multiple perspectives. And the second is to understand City Council's key priorities and values as we prepare to bring forward legal agreements with our city, private, and community partners later this spring. There are two things that we're not going to address today. The first is that we are not seeking any predetermination of any master plan approval issues for the USPS master plan site, or master plan currently being considered by Design Commission. The second is that we're not planning to dig into the details of project funding or the draft legal agreements with our partners, as they are still in flux, and we will be discussing those in more detail next week. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take about 25 minutes to give an overview of the project and process to date. Shannon, Vivian, and Mark will then each share their perspective and priorities with you. And then we'll hear from key partners who have shaped the project, including representatives from our public partners, steering committee members, and the Healthy Communities Coalition. Everyone has agreed to keep their comments focused to ensure that we have enough time at the end to hear your questions and your priorities. So, next slide, please. What do we mean when we say Broadway Corridor? The Broadway Corridor is a 34-acre district in green on this slide that includes the 14-acre USPS site, jointly owned by Prosper Portland and the Portland Housing Bureau, as well as Prosper Portland-owned development opportunities at what we call Block R and the Broadway Bridge site, where Oregon Harbor of Hope is currently located. It also includes Union Station, which is owned by Prosper Portland, as well as Greyhound, the former Greyhound bus terminal, PNCA, and the adjacent future park owned by Portland Parks and Recreation. So this is a district with a lot of development potential in the heart of our city. Next slide. The project's vision statement notes that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity and speaks to our collective desire to create a uniquely Portland, vibrant, forward-looking, mixed-use, dense urban district that has history and culture, smart growth, and social equity and inclusion at its core. Next slide. From 1964 to 2019, Broadway Corridor was home to the main U.S. Postal Service processing facility for all of Oregon and Southwest Washington. But Broadway Corridor and adjacent blocks have a longer history as a center of commerce and a landing port for new Portlanders. That includes a Chinookian center of commerce and the home to Wapato Valley people, Chinese American rail workers, and a train station that was once envisioned to be the largest rail terminal in the nation. The site of the first performance of jazz in the city at the Golden West Hotel, and a thriving Japantown before Japanese American residents were forced into internment camps during World War II. Next slide. The USPS site provides us with the opportunity to reimagine a central portion of Broadway Corridor into a 21st century center of commerce as a welcoming place for new Portlanders and those whose families and communities have long ties to the district. Connecting the Pearl District and Old Town Chinatown, development of the USPS property could house between 1,800 to 2,400 new households and support between 400 to 8,800 jobs. This reflects nearly 10% of the jobs and residents projected to be added to the central city by 2035. If this growth needed to be absorbed in other locations across our region, it could take 400 acres of land and hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure investment to service the same number of people and of jobs and families with greater climate and transportation impacts for our region. Redeveloping the post office site has long been a goal of the City of Portland, going back to at least the 1988 Central City Plan. In the West Quadrant and Central City 2035 plans, the site was identified as perhaps the most significant opportunity within Portland Central City. In October of 2015, as negotiations with the USPS were showing promise, City Council approved the Broadway Corridor Framework Plan, which provided information on the financial viability of acquisition and public investment. To execute on the acquisition and the framework plan, Council authorized up to a $40 million line of credit backed by River District TIF income, which includes post office land sales as the first line of repayment, anticipated to be repaid in 21 or 22. At the time, council action also established some high-level expectations for the site, including that 30% of the residential units would be affordable. In partnership with the Portland Housing Bureau, Prosper Portland then acquired the site in 2016 for an acquisition price of $88 million, which was used for the USPS to relocate to Colwood Industrial Park. Pursuant to the 2015 Framework Plan, City Council also approved increased height and FAR entitlements on the site. And with those changes, the site can now accommodate 4 million square feet of mixed-use development. Next slide. So as we gained ownership of the site, we set out to approach this project differently than past major development opportunities that Prosper and the city have been involved with. We undertook a racial equity impact assessment where we examined the ways that Prosper had previously engaged in large development agreements and identified ways to interrupt the status quo and bring about more equitable outcomes. As a result, we engaged diverse stakeholders through a steering committee and our community engagement process very early in the project, even before we selected our development partner, and we committed to engaging in a community benefits agreement. The Broadway Corridor Steering Committee was comprised of the 37 individuals you see on the slide, representing a diversity of community, private, and nonprofit organizations, geographies, and lived experiences. From spring of 2017 to summer of 2019, the steering committee advised Prosper Portland and the Portland Housing Bureau on goals for the project, including criteria for and selection of a development partner, priorities for mix of uses, equitable engagement, and community benefits, and the physical configuration of streets, parks, greenery, and sustainable practices. Next slide. Alongside the steering committee process, we sought to engage a diversity of community members in a meaningful way. Over the course of 18 months, we held 5 open houses and hosted 6 pop-up events from Union Station to the Rosewood Initiative. We hosted 4 online forums to solicit input from community members not able to join in person, and we facilitated 10 focus groups in partnership with Lara Media and JLA Public Involvement, with important groups like low-income residents of the Broadway Corridor, individuals with disabilities, faith leaders, and the Japanese American community. Through this engagement, more than 1,000 people provided meaningful input. I'd like to recognize Myra Ariola, June Reyes, and Victoria Lara, and everyone who helped shape this engagement and participate and encouraged robust participation. Through this engagement, we heard specific recommendations like those you see reflected here for affordable housing or active community space. And there's a lot more that you can find out in the community engagement report I think each of your offices have, but this is a robust accounting of what we heard from the community. The steering committee helped us digest the feedback we received and established a set of guiding principles that became our collective North Star. The guiding principles included ensuring that the project fostered accountability, connections, equity, prosperity, resilience, and vibrancy. We deeply appreciate the steering committee for their incredible 2-year commitment of time and expertise to the project, and we look forward to hearing from some of those partners shortly. Next slide. In keeping with these aspirations and values, as the mayor mentioned, we envision Broadway Corridor as Portland's next great place. A place that holds a significant role in the hearts of Portlanders alongside Pioneer Square or Peninsula Park, the Gateway Discovery Park, or the Portland Mercado, and is meaningful to those who call the neighborhood home, their place of employment, or the location to open their first retail shop. As envisioned, this project will foster economic opportunity through quality jobs, small business opportunities from construction through operations. This map shows the site plan and with anticipated uses, including prioritizing small business opportunities along the main street of Northwest Johnson. The northern end will provide opportunities for anchor employers and a diversity of office and retail uses. The development in total will create approximately 6,000 construction jobs and include commitments to 30% workforce diversity and 20% apprenticeship requirements, as well as the use of at least 20% certified firms. The city's infrastructure work and Prosper's demolition of the USPS facility will align with the city's CBA standards, which are normally reserved for projects over $25 million, and will result in augmented COEP 1% contributions to support business technical assistance and workforce development. I'll also highlight Continuum's willingness to the use of responsible contractors in all commercial buildings for janitorial and security services on site. This designation ensures they provide good wages and benefits, prioritize worker safety, and allow for employees to have a voice on the job. Next slide. The Broadway Corridor site is at the heart of a transportation network that includes light rail, streetcar, and bus, as well as Union Station. Our vision builds on this infrastructure to create a unique, accessible, diverse, and stunning space that increases connections to people across the region. We foresee a new terminus of the North Park blocks with a large gathering area that feels welcoming to all ages and abilities, fosters a space for community interaction, and allows for different activities and needs. We envision a people and pedestrian-friendly public realm with the extension of Northwest Kearny, Park Avenue, and Johnson, which will encourage east-west pedestrian and bike traffic. A similar north-south connection via the Green Loop that climbs from street grade to the Broadway Lovejoy ramp will meet a goal of 70 to 80% non-single occupancy vehicle trips by 2035. While creating a signature Portland element that connects East Portland and the Broadway Bridge directly with the North Park blocks. Next slide. We've also thought long and hard about the people that will live, work, and play in this place, and how to ensure that it is intentionally and overtly welcoming and accessible to people of different races, ages, household sizes, and incomes. Building on the framework plan, our vision includes a firm commitment to 720 affordable housing units in the site and adjacent to the district's central amenities. We've planned for community space for programming and for public art that will honor and reflect the history of this neighborhood while celebrating and empowering Portland's diverse communities. We've committed to creating opportunities that foster wealth creation for diverse local businesses and to pursuing property investment and ownership structures to increase asset development for communities of color. And in a less visible but equally important way, our approach to development and accountability will model partnership and inclusion. We intend to create an oversight model that supports implementation of this plan and includes community voices alongside developers and contractors through construction and build-out of the site. And finally, this project will further the city's climate action and resilience objectives through high environmental standards in project design, construction, and development, starting with a requirement that all new development achieve LEED Gold standards or better. We are working to identify alternative energy strategies that strive for 100% renewables with a long-range climate action target of net zero carbon. And we know transportation demand management from parking, pricing, or transit incentives will be an important complement to the infrastructure investments. With a vision so large, we know that no one entity can bring it to life. Partnership and collaboration have been essential to get us to this point. And it's safe to say an even broader team will be needed to deliver on the plan over the next 20 years. Next slide. We are deeply appreciative of the partners that have walked with us thus far. We want to recognize the enormous investment of time and talent by our city partners from the Portland Housing Bureau, Portland Bureau of Transportation, Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, Bureau of Development Services, Parks and Recreation, Bureau of Environmental Services, Water, and the Office of Management and Finance. From an affordable housing strategy to planning for open space, the Green Loop, or street designs, to detailed engineering and financing discussions about utility upgrades, construction, or procurement for the city's infrastructure investments. Each of these bureaus have contributed creativity and commitment to create a truly citywide shared approach. We also want to acknowledge and appreciate the instrumental role Healthy Communities Coalition has played in setting our path. HCC let us know early on in the process that they intended to negotiate a CBA for this development, so we've been on this journey together for 3 years. They've made a positive difference each step of the way, and we appreciate their partnership and Vivian's leadership throughout. Continuum Partners was selected as our development advisor based on their experience and commitment to triple bottom line development. They have been at and stayed at the table for the past 2 years. Their advice has been invaluable in the process, working through issues from truing up costs to design solutions. And we appreciate Mark's leadership and their commitment to finding implementable ways for the private sector to push the envelope for community benefit outcomes. We also appreciate the ingenuity of PGE and Northwest Natural and Bureau of Planning and Sustainability that they've brought to the table to together identify a market-based approach to reducing carbon reliance. And we have been supported by a mighty team of consultants listed here that has presented and spoken to Portland's many neighborhoods, encouraged and digested public feedback, created beautiful renderings, investigated the history, advised us on feasibility, and brought their unique design talents and vision to this project. As we've briefed you and your staff and have talked with the community, we've often used the analogy of trying to land 4 airplanes at once as we prepare to kick off implementation of this vision. Because we're in active negotiations, meaning we haven't yet fully landed on some key terms, I'll just touch on the scope of each of these agreements, or each of the airplanes. So the first is the master plan, which is currently in review for Design Commission, and why we are not talking about anything having to do with the master plan in detail. And that will establish the infrastructure standards and building envelopes within which development can occur. The second is the disposition and development agreement between Continuum and Prosper Portland, which will focus on the sale of the properties of the northern end of the post office site over the next decade, together with related development, infrastructure, and community benefits agreement. Since the summer of 2019, Prosper, Healthy Communities Coalition, and Continuum have met to negotiate a community benefits agreement that will reflect both public and private commitments. We are currently working on reaching tentative agreement on a term sheet that would speak to construction equity, operations, affordable housing, sustainability, business equity, tenanting, and oversight. And finally, public infrastructure and affordable housing land transfer commitments will be executed via individual intergovernmental agreements. And these agreements will detail funding and finance responsibilities by public and private partners, relevant elements of the community benefits agreements, and delivery expectations. As a true public-private community partnership, the elements of the agreement are closely tied and must align with one another. We cannot accomplish the vision we've set forth today without significant private commitment and capital to execute on those outcomes. We anticipate that our development partners will need to secure about $1 billion in outside capital to deliver on this project over the next 15 to 20 years. Public investment in site acquisition and preparation is about $125 million, which is essentially supported by River District tax increment. Future public and private investment in streets, open space, and utilities will be about $75 million. We're working closely with our Bureau partners to align public infrastructure financing like system development charges to public infrastructure priorities, as well as to identify private infrastructure financing mechanisms like local improvement districts. Shannon will speak separately to the capital required to deliver on affordable housing, so that's not included in this chart. The yellow portion that is currently TBD represents those particular community benefits that will require additional investment with tools outside of the city or private sector's conventional means, and will need to be found from either land sales, being invested in these community benefits, or bringing other additional resources to bear. We look forward to engaging with Council further on February 4th at the work session to review agreement negotiations and investment scenarios in further detail and to receive initial direction from Council. So we wanted to close our section today with some specifics around immediate next steps before I hand it over to Shannon. So we'll be back, as I mentioned, to discuss the negotiations in an executive session, and then this spring, Design Commission will hold hearings on the master plan, and will bring the key development disposition agreement, community benefits agreement, and intergovernmental agreement term sheets to you for your consideration. We're also moving forward with the interim activation plan, relocating the USPS retail to the adjacent garage, and pursuing demolition of the vacant buildings. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Shannon to discuss the affordable housing strategy.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. Shannon Callahan of the Portland Housing Bureau. The Portland Housing Bureau is a co-owner of the post office site. As Kimberly mentioned, we invested $14.5 million in tax increment financing to secure approximately 16% of the overall development rights. The affordable housing we create will be for families who make less than 60% of area median income. For a 3-person family, that would mean a household who makes less than $47,000 or less per year. That would be housing that's affordable for people like preschool teachers, service workers, or seniors on a fixed income. The Housing Bureau is committed to achieving 720 units of affordable housing within the Broadway corridor. The strategy to achieve this goal is twofold. First, to provide land and Housing Bureau financing to affordable housing owners and developers, and secondly, to use inclusionary housing. Market rate developers within the corridor will be bound to meet their inclusionary housing requirements at 60% of area median income. While the number of units to be created through direct financing and inclusionary housing has flexed over time, our commitment to create 720 units of affordable housing has remained constant. As the post office site and corridor has taken shape, with gathering spaces, roads to accommodate bikes and pedestrians and other community amenities, the Housing Bureau has worked closely with Prosper Portland to select parcels to ensure we are able to reach our shared commitment. As we approached the selection of parcels within the district, we were guided by 5 key values. First and foremost, to reach our goal. We also wanted to be sure that we were providing housing for a range of household types, sizes, and needs. We wanted to maximize connectivity and proximity to site amenities and public spaces. We considered the cost effectiveness of development, and we prioritized the livability and quality of life for those who will make these new developments their home. Guided by these values, we selected an entire city block alongside the new park in the heart of the corridor to create 2 separate and distinct new developments. This parcel selection also has the benefit of ensuring we can create affordable housing in the first phase of development. In combination, we believe this block will allow for the creation of 440 units of affordable housing. In addition to this block, with input from the Corridor Steering Committee, Prosper Portland and the Housing Bureau have identified 2 additional parcels for affordable housing development. Prosper has offered to co-develop the NATO Broadway Bridge parcel in a mixed-use development, or alternatively to use a portion of the Prosper-owned site at Block R. Based on current market assumptions and the present plan for development of market rate units in the corridor, we estimate that the Housing Bureau will be contributing just over 30% of the overall financing needed to reach our 720 unit goal, with private capital contributing approximately 70% of the total cost. I'd also like to note that we have a commitment to the history of the neighborhood as well, and would like to ensure that our tenanting, marketing, and services on site are appropriately tailored to reach the Native American, Black, Japanese American, and Chinese American communities. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Vivian.
Thank you so much. Hi, Mayor,
Good afternoon.
Commissioners. It's great to see you all today. My name is Vivian Satterfield. I'm proud to work for Verde, and I'm here today with my colleagues and many members in the audience from the Healthy Communities Coalition. Years ago, we came together as a coalition to work together at the intersection of racial, environmental, and economic justice. The opportunity to apply our analysis to the Broadway corridor redevelopment is in turn an opportunity for a community to hold private developers and the city's redevelopment agency, Prosper Portland, accountable to community-defined outcomes of success. Prosper Portland's presentation, I'm pleased, acknowledges the history of the Broadway corridor, a place in which Portland's communities have been transacted upon as opposed to alongside. From the very beginning, the Broadway corridor is on stolen, unceded land of Indigenous and tribal communities. It is a place that was once home to a thriving Black community who were then forcibly displaced across the river. A place that was once home to Chinese and Japanese Americans who were forced into internment camps. The history and memory of our communities is deep in this soil. Myself and other HCC members devoted over 2 years to serving on the Broadway Corridor Steering Committee in order to participate in Prosper's public involvement process as a key stakeholder. And we were buoyed by Prosper's opening commitment to an anti-racist framework. HCC has always been clear about our vision for equitable development on this site. We've also been clear that we know the most proven and effective tool for achieving this vision
is through a legally binding community benefits agreement, where the community has real power to effectively enforce the obligations that we win through direct negotiations. And because of that, we believed you, Mayor Wheeler, and you, Director Branham, when you said in an early steering committee meeting that this project would have a CBA. We've been encouraged by the high caliber advisors that Prosper has brought into this process, national experts on CBAs such as Jamise Myers and Cecilia Estelano. CBAs are proven tools for development that have been applied to projects in communities across the country, both larger and smaller than Portland, including Pittsburgh, Nashville, Atlanta, LA, Oakland, and Seattle. So we're excited that Portland is ready to join these national leaders and Prosper in equitable development by negotiating the first ever comprehensive CBA here. We've been at the negotiation table, as mentioned, for over half a year now. While we're seeing encouraging movement, we've been urged to temper our expectations, to be ready to make compromises. Our communities of color, working families, and those still seeking to secure economic opportunity in the city of Portland will not compromise yet again for someone else's economic interest. We've come too far, invested too much time, and will not easily give up this opportunity to build Portland's newest neighborhood from the strong foundation of racial equity, economic justice, and environmental sustainability. And with that, I want to be clear that Healthy Communities Coalition will not sign an agreement that doesn't deliver on the promise that this project will be racially just. If the city and Prosper are truly for racial equity, we say prove it. Prove it by ensuring the CBA includes equitable access to construction jobs and contracting, opportunities for everyone, including women and people of color. Prove it by offering sufficient resources to create career pathways. Prove it by signing an agreement that offers fair wages, benefits, and a voice on the job for the workers who not only build the buildings, but also for those who work in them later on. We say prove it with meaningful oversight and enforcement tools, including a project labor agreement, which is a tried and true method to meet equity objectives in construction, job quality standards that cover building owners and tenants over the life of the project, and that community organizations are empowered and funded to give project oversight and enforcement over the long term. This is an entire generation of development we're going to see here 20 years, and our communities want and are asking for that oversight. We will not sign away our right to protest this project until we are sure we are getting a just and ironclad agreement for our communities in exchange. And I invite you all to hear directly from HCC members on why they're here with us today on a later panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Mark Falcone, and I'm the CEO of Continuum Partners. We were the development firm. Am I saying 6 to 8 inches? I'm trying to see if I'm in that. Okay. And we were very fortunate to be invited to sit beside Prosper and all of the community constituent groups over a couple of years ago to really to become the planning advisor on this project from a private development standpoint. I've said to many people that are probably here in this room today, and I don't know if I've had the opportunity to say it to all of you, but we were simply drawn to this project because of your aspirations for a very supportive and ambitious community benefits agenda. I'm not going to pretend that we were, wandering around looking for an opportunity to invest in the center city of Portland. I don't think we would be in Portland absent your solicitation for this kind of a venture and this kind of a project. And I have to say that after just short of 2 years of real deep engagement on it, I feel as though our enterprise, our company, and myself personally have been substantially enriched by these conversations, by this dialogue, and by the collective effort that everybody who has been at the table in this project and the wisdom that they've brought to it. I like to say that, we are effectively in the business of human ecology. What we do is basically build and design and conceive of and then administer and manage the human habitat. And I think that what you have set out to accomplish here as a community is to be applauded. I do think that you are exploring issues that other communities haven't found the resources or the courage to step into yet. Now, all that said, our job, obviously, is to also be the financial steward of this project as well. And there's certainly many things that, that this project will encompass that will limit some of the capital providers that can come to a project like this. We think that's fine, because we do think that some of the capital providers out there are not going to be as well aligned with the long-term community benefits that that the city of Portland and the residents are seeking. I like to say that, our job, what I love about what I do every day is we work on three-dimensional crossword puzzles. Nothing can sort of exist independent of a consequence that impacts many other things. And so as we try to balance for you all of the various demands on this project, our job is to continue to try to meter for you what things will impact the other parts of the project that may be, less negotiable. I mean, the city certainly has expectations for the financial resources that this project will take. If we want to open the piggy bank, which we'd love, by the way, we'd love to do everything on everybody's list, but we will continue to be a strong advisor and a strong advocate to help you understand what the various implications are and how one implication creates an unintended consequence in another. But sometimes we find great pattern-solving solutions along the way, too, where we are able to bring together many things that independently and collectively help to fulfill the broader community's objectives. So I'd like to just end by thanking Council, the mayor, for terrific leadership. I think that the folks at Prosper have been a phenomenal thought partner along the way. And I really have enjoyed the opportunity to get to know so many members of your community through the steering committee and through the HCC interactions. So thank you for the opportunity to be here, and we look forward to being able to not only get this project built, but then learn from it together over the next 20 years.
Thank you, Mark. We appreciate it. Thank you, all of you. And
Can we ask questions?
Sure. Yeah, why don't we do that before each panel disperses? Commissioner Hardesty, you first.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all for a very detailed presentation. I want to applaud Prosper Portland for leading with, Prosper Portland and the Housing Bureau for leading with housing that people can afford to live in. Because we've had big development projects that have promised housing people could afford to live in the past. And then, oops, we just never got around to building that housing. So I am greatly appreciative that we're leading with housing that people can afford to live in. And 30% of the area median income is a very good place for us to be. So. It breaks your heart when you think $47,000 doesn't actually buy much in the city of Portland today. So thank you both for that. I also want to remind Kimberly that when we first started talking about this project, I was very concerned that we hired an out-of-town advisor, and your response was, hold me accountable, because there will be opportunities for local contractors to make money off of this generational project. I don't see it yet. Where is it?
So we are in the process of negotiating. Lisa, can you bring up the slide that shows the site? So we are in the process of negotiating with Continuum for the northern end of the district, so largely commercial. You can see it here in yellow on the map. We would anticipate that Continuum will have a number of partners. They will select a general contractor. There are requirements that 22% of the firms be certified that are working on the construction. We've also have a element in the term sheet. It hasn't been ratified yet, but an element in the term sheet that talks about ways to look at innovative investment models. So the Mercy Corps Community Investment Trust is one that we've looked at. But I think we are still very early in the negotiation process. We do anticipate, as soon as we are able to put out the southern portion, which is largely residential, we would anticipate that there will be, in addition to local affordable housing developers, that there will be other developers who will come in. Continuum has not expressed an interest in the southern part of it, and so I think you're going to see a mixture.
Just know that I'm going to continue to ask that
Yes.
question every time you come to me
Yes.
with this project,
Thank you.
okay?
Yep.
Because we have made a commitment that I want to make sure that we live up to.
Absolutely.
So the 22% certified firms is fine, but as you know, many small minority-owned and women-owned firms do not go through the process of state certification because it is meaningless for them, and it only helps white majority contractors. What other avenue are we going to use to engage small minority and women-owned firms who are very qualified to do the work, but they don't go through the certification because that's not something that helps them?
Well, I think we have a number of technical assistance providers who, while they're working to either increase awareness about projects, will encourage companies to be certified. And we have specifically called for, and on the term sheet there is a requirement currently that within the 22%, that 12% are MBE certified, MBE or DBE certified. So it can't be all ESBs and meet our goals. There's another requirement that, and this is in line with the city's community benefits agreement policy, that there's a 5% goal for WBE or WDBE firms.
And for folks who are wondering what the heck we're talking about, we're talking women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses,
Yeah,
and emerging small businesses.
Thank
We get into that alphabet
Yes,
soup, and
thank
people
you.
go, "What the heck are they talking about?"
Yeah.
Again, I mean, this is a generational project,
Yeah.
and the decisions that we make today will carry out over the next 20 years of development, right? And I am very concerned that we start off very strong and very centered on those communities who, you know, over and over again gets lots of promises but never get the benefit of the development that takes place. And so what's been your experience at Continuum for really engaging contractors of color, whether or not they have state certification? And what's been your success rate in that effort?
Well, we actually have a platform, which is not a conventional real estate development platform, at the Denver International Airport, where we own and facilitated 40 retail kiosks that are in the center concourse. And the idea was that it was a program to really encourage and help cultivate small business enterprises that could eventually, get established and eventually perhaps grow into permanent inline tenants at the airport. And we started out, when we started that program, and the alphabet soup, and that one is ACDBWBE.
Oh, that's even worse than
yes.
ours. Oh, my gosh.
And we started out with a 22% goal, and it was 22% not just participation, but sales. And we were able to outperform that in our first 7-year term pretty significantly. We, in our renewal with the city of Denver and the airport authority, we increased that to 40%. And right now, I just saw the report yesterday, we're at 50%. And we've now graduated several small businesses into permanent operations. Now, believe me, there's plenty that haven't been able to make it, but we have visual merchandise experts that help them. We help them curate their product and their offering. We help them with hiring. We help them with inventory management. We provide a tremendous amount of support and capacity building in that process.
Thank you very much for that. That gives me a little less anxiety knowing that you've actually had that experience, so I appreciate that. Ms. Sutterfield, thank you so much for being here. I want to talk to you about the Healthy Communities Coalition. I know that that you've been working a long time as part of the coalition with Prosper and Continuum around community benefit agreements and just setting some guidelines about how this development process will happen. And I wanted to talk to you about whether or not there will be a oversight committee that will meet monthly to determine whether the goals are clearly being met, and if they're not being met, how do we change it so that we are meeting our goals, right? So some projects we wait till the end and then we evaluate and we scratch our head and wonder why we didn't reach our goal. Some projects, we actually put groups together that meet monthly and they check the numbers and they make corrections where they need to. Where does this project fit?
Commissioner Hardesty, can you see into the future? Because I'm working on that like this weekend as well, alongside my partners. I'm so glad you asked that. That's some of the details that we have yet to bring forward in more detail to the negotiating table to talk about what the vision and most effective ways of community oversight are. We're lucky, again, to have so many effective CBA models across the country to compare and draw from. The advisors to the process to Prosper have also put forward some of those things for us to look at. And I agree that a frequent, although that may seem arduous, time commitment, but we've already invested so much time in this, and that's why I emphasized in my comments that I think funding is really important to ensure that communities can be at the table and stay at the table in order to devote the time necessary to ensuring that you can hold not only the private development partner, but also the public agency accountable to that. And I agree, I think a monthly basis is a very smart way to approach it, especially because payroll comes on a monthly basis.
That's right.
So thank you.
And so my last question, and I really appreciate my colleagues' patience because they know that I'm a geek about this kind of stuff. My last question has to do with prevailing wage. If we made prevailing wage 100% across the board, that puts small mom and pop contractors at an extreme disadvantage. When you're trying to grow a 1 and 2 person shop and you have to have the same standards that the big boy shops have, you will never, ever, ever be able to effectively compete. Is there an opportunity for us to think about how we allow those small minority women-owned businesses to grow into a prevailing wage? I want to be really clear. I absolutely support prevailing wage, but I also know that historically over the years, it's done a real disadvantage to trying to help grow small minority and women-owned businesses. Because if they can't compete, they can't get the contract and they can't grow.
Thank you for your question. I'll start with 2 points. The first one being that I believe the determination for whether or not the project will prevail is determined by BOLI, the Bureau of
Labor and
Industries.
So is it the project or is it the contractors that are hired? I'm just kind of confused about how that process works.
Kimberly, could you explain that, please?
Right, so Vivian is correct. Bureau of Labor and Industries makes the determination at the beginning of projects that have public investments. The public agency is responsible for informing the Bureau of Labor and Industries that we believe it either should prevail or should not prevail. BOLI then says, yes, you're correct, or we don't agree with you. I think that the issue has been an important one from Healthy Communities Coalition, and there's been some conversation about potentially having some portion of the project be voluntarily prevail, but not the whole of it. But this is part of the active negotiations, and so we haven't finalized that portion.
I'll also offer that one of the panelists for the Healthy Communities Coalition can give you some more detail around that point, and I would love to follow up with yourself and your office around that. Thank you.
As would I. Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you all. Were there any other questions for this panel? Thank you all very much. Next, we're going to hear from our public partners panel. We have Adina Long from Portland Parks and Recreation, Chris Werner from the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and Andrea Durbin from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here.
Good afternoon. Mayor, City Commissioners, I'm Andrea Durbin, the Director of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We appreciate being a part of this afternoon's presentation and are very excited about this project. With the Broadway Corridor, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to show the nation and the world that it is possible to build and design a large residential and employment district that emits no carbon. Currently, all buildings in Portland generate 40% of the area's carbon emissions, nearly as much as the transportation sector. Of those buildings, half of the emissions come from large commercial and multifamily residential buildings, such as those that will be built in the Broadway Corridor. With potentially 4 million square feet of new development coming online, Portland has a unique opportunity to ensure that this project meets our climate goals to be net zero carbon for all new construction by 2030 and to be 100% renewable. With the Broadway corridor, we can design and build a neighborhood that is more resilient, saves residents and businesses money on their monthly utility bills, and will be healthier for residents and the community at large. It means we need to design, build, and operate Broadway corridor so that the buildings are highly efficient and the energy supply to heat and power the development is 100% renewable. And the development fosters walking, biking, and offers low-carbon ways to get around, including electric vehicles and other mobility options, and that it reduces the carbon embodied in the building materials, such as using low-carbon cement. The Broadway Corridor project also offers an opportunity to build a major section and connection for the Green Loop, one of the big ideas that emerged in the Central City Plan 2035. A collaborative effort amongst many bureaus, including Parks, PBOT, BES, and BPS, the Green Loop is being designed and built as big public and private projects move forward in the city. The Green Loop is a 6-mile linear park following an inner circle around the Willamette River, in that it will provide residents, workers, visitors with access to more places to experience the central city in an entirely new way and enliven this part of the city, including previously inaccessible U.S. Postal Service site, as it's transformed into a green and sustainable neighborhood. It will run through the Broadway corridor from the park blocks to the south, across the Broadway Bridge to the north, through the Lloyd District and across the new Earl Blumenauer Bridge, then head south and connect with the Tillicum Crossing, bringing pedestrians, cyclists, runners, rollers, strollers, full circle through South Waterfront to PSU and the Cultural District. The Green Loop will add to the city's active transportation network, offering a free, safe, and comfortable option and be an all ages and all abilities route. It will also increase access to a wide variety of parks and open spaces, and it increase the tree canopy, which mitigates against the heat island effect in an area of the city that's dominated by buildings and streets. And it will link neighborhoods and connect important destinations, retail and employment centers, civic and cultural institutions, parks and attractions to each other and the rest of Portland. The Green Loop will serve as the green heart of the Broadway corridor development, and we appreciate the partnership with Prosper Parks, PBOT, and BES to help realize the Green Loop in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Mayor Wheeler, Commissioners, Chris Warner, Director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Thank you for our opportunity to contribute to this update. This really is oh, there we go. Sorry. Oh, hello. Again, Chris Warner, Director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Mayor, Commissioners, thank you. This really is, as everyone said, a transformational project for the city and really reshape the way that we get in and around the central city. And we're very happy to partner on this project because we really do believe it can make a major contribution, as I said, to make it easier to walk, bike, and to take transit around the central city. In turn, such a shift on how people get around will really help us with our sustainability goals as well as our safety goals, which are paramount to the Bureau. As this project develops, we are really playing 4 major roles. First, we are a partner in the planning, design, and construction of the Green Loop elements that Andrea was talking about. Second, we have the regulatory oversight over the proposed transportation improvements and the strategies that will be put in place to make sure that the impact on the overall transportation system and the environment will be minimized. Our charge in this respect is to make sure that the development partners follow through on their commitments to improve the transportation system and to put into place the appropriate strategies to encourage people to stay out of their cars and to minimize the number of single occupancy vehicle trips. Third, we will be the future maintenance provider and will take care of the basic street elements as they become part of the public right-of-way. And finally, in creation of this really innovative neighborhood design to encourage walking and biking, it really does take a high level of investment. So given its importance, we really anticipate using our system development charges to move this project forward because it really will make the big difference in terms of the goals we're trying to hit in the central city. And at this current stage, PBOT staff are working on the very multiple fronts on this project to move forward, including the development review. We're working to make sure that the master plan meets the requirements and to get to the necessary approvals. And we're also, the PBOT planners are updating the Pearl District street design standards to reflect the new district streets and provide clear guidance to development phases over time to make sure that the design of the streets and the development frontages work for this new and innovative district. The Bureau is also reviewing the Transportation Demand Management Program, with suggestions to Continuum and Prosper to ensure that there is the adequate programmatic support for district employees and residents to travel to and from the district without needing private automobiles. So as we said, we're looking forward to working with Prosper, Continuum, Portland Housing Bureau, and all of our partners, both public and private, to make sure that the next steps of this project are moving forward. So I'm happy to answer any questions and turn over to Adina.
Thank you. Director Long, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. For the benefit of others in attendance, I'm Adina Long, Portland Parks and Recreation Director. I'm happy to join you today to provide testimony on the Broadway Corridor project. The Broadway Corridor represents a unique opportunity within the central city to create an exciting mixed-use development on an approximate 34-acre site with future buildings surrounding a critical, vibrant, urban open space. By 2035, we estimate that the central city will be gaining about 38,000 new households and about 51,000 new jobs. The new extended park sequence has the potential to provide necessary community open space in the already park-lean central city. Portland Parks is committed to designing and constructing the Pacific Northwest College of Art, or PNCA, North Park Block, located directly south of the PNCA block within the next 3 to 4 years. Within that PNCA block design process, Parks will be leading the development of conceptual plans for the full parks sequence, including the 2 additional Broadway Corridor park blocks and the Green Loop design, working in partnership with Prosper Portland, PBOT, BES, Continuum, and others. This affords the opportunity to design the park blocks holistically. These park blocks are a natural extension of the existing North Park blocks, furthering the vision to create a green ribbon throughout the city. Parks has been working with and will continue to work with collaboratively with Prosper Portland, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, PBOT, BES, the Housing Bureau, and others to identify shared objectives and funding strategies for the development and design of the Central Park space and Green Loop. We fully support and applaud Prosper Portland in their efforts to shepherd this exciting proposed Broadway corridor development. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for this panel? I want to thank you all and your bureaus for your continued leadership and your continued engagement. And I know you all have independently very full plates. But as I'm sure you heard and understand and appreciated from the first panel, that this is a very, very big vision, and it's an important one, and it's going to guide not only how we do future development in the city, it's going to guide how we work internally as a city and through our own bureaus. So I want to thank you all for the commitment, leadership that you've already shown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next panel will be our steering committee, representatives of our steering committee. We have Sam Rodriguez, James Paulson, Victoria Lara, and Tyrone Poole. Come on up. Thank you for being here. And unless you so choose, you don't have to go in any particular order. Ladies first. Very good.
Oh, wow, okay, thank you. Buenas tardes, Mayor and Commissioners.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. It is a pleasure to be here and testify for this amazing project. I'm a business owner, I'm an immigrant, and I have a firm, a communication and engagement firm, and we have the honor to produce and develop the strategic communication and engagement plan for this project. It is an amazing opportunity. We started at the end of 2016, and it was a great experience for us.
Ma'am, could you put your name into the record?
Victoria Lara, thank you. The commitment was to authentically engage residents and motivate them to actively participate and express their opinions, to develop a sense of ownership of the project to maximize community benefits agreement, with the intention of creating spaces, particular for traditionally disengaged residents, communities that has historical mistrust of the government, like communities of color, residents that at or below, below federal poverty levels, they usually don't benefit for these kind of development projects. You know, community engagement is really one of the best tools to build social equity in any project. We love doing this, we love what we do, and we know how important and vital is this. This project, with the leadership of Prosper Portland, was created with the lens of racial equity, using traditional and non-traditional strategies, multicultural and multilingual, cultural responsive engagement tactics. We facilitate and guide and eliminate the barriers to have thousands of conversations with focus groups, roundtable discussions, community events, pop-up tents. We listen, but not just listen, we deeply listen what people needed to say. Because for us, we say it was not, as the mayor said, it was not about the project, it was not about the building or the development, it was always centered and focused on the people, particularly the people that usually doesn't benefit for these projects. We listen construction workers, business owners, displaced residents, homeless, people with disabilities, kids. We develop and we're able to listen everybody that was invited and motivated to participate in this process. We provide them with the space to feel safe, because it's not just inviting people, as you know, real and authentic community engagement, invite, but also go where the people are and provide a safe space for people to really participate and engage and provide their opinions and know that somebody's listened to them. We provide the spaces, the tools, the resources, the opportunities to fully participate in this process. All the input received was used and incorporated into the decision-making process. Is no doubt the opinions tailored and guide the Broadway Corridor project, and they build a more sustainable and equitable process now. Since we already listened to this and participate and motivate these people, now we hold accountable the city and Prosper Portland to continue to provide what these participants require. They share their dreams, they share their challenge, they share what they really want and their vision, and we have all this information to hold them accountable and to support them with the work they're doing. But it was an unprecedented work for these projects, the engagement and the way the equity was offer for these people to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon.
Mayor, Commissioners, thank you for giving me the Is it on? Okay, it's not on. Here we go.
Thanks.
6 inches. There we go. Mayor and Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Sam Rodriguez. I'm the Senior Managing Director of Mill Creek Residential. We're a national multifamily developer, market rate developer. We've developed in the last 7 years about 2,000 homes in Portland, and have currently about 1,000 homes in the pipeline. All of those 1,000 including inclusionary housing, so totally participating in the new program. It's great. It's a fantastic opportunity to do this. I'm also a design review commissioner and the president of Oregon Smart Growth, which, as his name says, is all about smart growth and about doing things that work for everybody. And I don't want to say that because even though we're developers, we're not the evil developers, we're community builders. My role in this commission was to, in part, to be the only developer in the commission and help bring to the conversation the business side of development. So it was sometimes a difficult conversation, but I got to give Prosper Portland kudos for putting together a team of people that respectfully were able to create communication between very different groups and races, both racial. I mean, there were women representing different parts of our community, and created a great opportunity to have very meaningful discussions that I think resulted in a very meaningful framework, or structural framework for this development to happen. it's going to be difficult to achieve everything, but I think there's a very strong, creative business community in Portland that will allow to create opportunities for a good bit of this to happen. My biggest fear coming into this was always, are we asking too much of it, and will it ever get built? Because if it doesn't get built, then none of it happens. And so I think, it was good to see that the whole group was able to ground itself when necessary to create the vision that we're here today. And I think everybody wants the same results. We just have to figure out how to make it happen. So thank you.
Key. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for having me here today.
Thanks, Tara.
Portland Development Commission was, my name is Tyrone Poole. I am a business owner in Portland. I am a member of the C-Ray Committee, and I'm also a member of the Steering Committee. And C-Ray, for those who don't know, is a group that was put together to be the equity lens for Prosper Portland. Portland Development Commission was known for trying to help minorities gain access to employment, but they called that equity. They also worked really hard to help people those minorities that did have access to employment to get meaningful employment that would be able to cover their expenses and even sometimes get up into management positions. But they called that wealth creation, and that's not actually the truth. So I had a really good time working with Prosper Portland under Kimberly's leadership and to be able to create better products to redefine what those definitions were. And on this Broadway Corridor project, my testimony will show that we came up with some really good ideas and had a lot of work done to help create real equity and real wealth creation opportunities. Before the testimony, I would make sure that I don't want anyone in this room to think that my testimony is a derogatory statement to all the work that they did to create meaningful employment. It's just not why I participated in the project. As a business owner, I learned how to read a P&L, and I know that wealth is created from profits. That's just a fact. It's a fundamental fact of business. Employees are also on a P&L, but they're under.
I don't know what P&L is.
Profit and loss statement.
Thank you.
Yes, for businesses. And employees are also on a profit and loss statement, but they're under expenses. And as a business owner, my primary objective for my shareholders, for myself, is to grow profits and minimize expenses. And so employees, at the end of the day, at the end of a 10-year employment history, even if this job does a really good job creating those employment opportunities, they usually end up where they were 10 years when they started. So I want to make sure that wealth is defined as being able to keep going after employment. That's basically how we are defining wealth creation. And we use that as the primary lens on this Broadway Corridor project, not just a lens. And standard is to use a financial lens as the primary lens. For example, if inside of the train station there's a space for a coffee shop, the person with the best P&L or the best financial strength, like a Starbucks, would get that opportunity. With this new equity lens being the prevailing lens, those opportunities would go to small business owners, minorities, like a Dead Stock Coffee or something local, because even though they may not financially be able to beat out the alternative, just like you were speaking about earlier, how we make sure that minorities get access, that is the lens that we chose to work with on this project. And to furthermore, we made sure that Prosper Portland was prepared for when those opportunities came. We worked with Kay at Prosper Portland, helped recreate his, and he was very excited and willing. He did an amazing job to recreate the loan product. So that way, when small businesses do get the opportunity, they have the financial means. And we make sure that the marketing, like you brought up earlier, to make sure that they knew these opportunities existed, was marketed correctly in the right communities. We did an absorbent amount of work on this. And for the first time, I think that all the communities were aligned with what the objective was. We saw success the same, which meant that all the communities lived and worked in this new part of city, Portland, together, not where it was, minorities lived on the outskirts, which is sometimes the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyrone. Good afternoon, and you can just slide that over. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. Excuse me. Hi, my name is James Paulson, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of coming up here and making a presentation in front of you. As you've heard a number of people talk about this project is really a lot different than anything that we've really seen in the past. But one of the perspectives I really want to give to you is as a small business owner and participating in this project over the last year and a half to 2 years, you have to really understand, as a small business owner, attending and doing these activities is almost like paying to participate, because you're taking away from that time at your business. And the fact that Prosper Portland was able to put together a process that was able to keep me and everyone else engaged, I think is a testament to the quality of work and the message in which is coming to you. There's a lot of energy and a lot of personal resource in those words in the presentation. And I really want you to understand that commitment of the people who did participate. And then I also want to really point out that as we talk about wealth creation and that sort of thing, we really need to also look at the programs that we have in place to develop future entrepreneurs. How can we get people out of, I have a decent paycheck, to I'm out creating wealth within my community that spans the spectrum of communities and different peoples. And, the city is challenged with a number of different things, but one of the things that we can't lose sight of is that we need to make investments in programs that are going to develop these next entrepreneurs. And I could go through and name off a number of programs, but I don't think that would be a good use of my time. I think the good use of my time is to drive home the point that if we don't make the investment in developing young entrepreneurs and new businesses, we are not going to find ourselves successful in the long run on building a community that's based on the principles that have been described here today. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Mayor.
Any questions? Commissioner Udaley.
I'm curious what your business is. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, it's all right. I am the owner of JMPDX Property Management.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate your comments. I think it's timely. It's frustrating that we put up a lot of barriers for people who we're trying to reach because they are disadvantaged, but people that have wealth and power don't have those same barriers. So I appreciate those comments. It's a second job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. I appreciate you mentioning the cost to small businesses to sit on these task force and to show up and actually provide your community expertise. And it is an issue that we at the city are really struggling with, because we should value your time as much as we value our own time. And so that is certainly something that we need to work on. As part of the committee, you may have heard me earlier ask about prevailing wage versus small businesses. Has that had an impact on your business or other businesses that any of you are in relationship to? And do you want to speak on prevailing wage versus going into prevailing wage?
My business specifically isn't impacted by prevailing wage. I do have a lot of experience in past career when I worked in HR.
Your past life?
Past life, yes, with prevailing wage. I think that prevailing wage is somewhat of a double-edged sword. And as you pointed out, that prevailing wage to a large employer is more of an administrative challenge.
Right.
With a smaller employer, it becomes more of a business imperative.
Yes.
And so as we're looking at these projects and opportunities, as you pushed Ms. Brannon on, show me the money.
Right.
Show me the money that's
about-
going into these small emerging businesses. I think prevailing wage is a bigger concern, but it has to be balanced against having the living wages ongoing in the businesses that are going to be created there. I think that we have a better understanding on the construction side, and I really appreciate the sentiments around having oversight and that sort of thing, but we're talking about a long-term project.
Yes.
And as we look at the businesses that are going to be locating there, we need to look more at businesses that are aligned with the tenants that we've pushed forward as far as the goals go, and less so on saying prevailing wage or no prevailing wage.
Because I think a bigger issue is bonding. And didn't hear anybody talk about bonding, especially for small businesses, when you have to have $1 million bond in order to even apply. That knocks a lot of small businesses right out of the competition at the front end. And so I hope that this steering committee will think about all the ways our systems impact people's ability to actually be able to apply and obtain those resources to build their business. So thank you all very much. Greatly appreciative.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
panel, great conversation, and thank you again, all of you, for your leadership and your time commitment. The last panel that I'd like to bring forward is the Healthy Communities Coalition. We heard a little bit from Vivian up front. There are 3 other individuals: Marcus Mundy from the Coalition of Communities of Color, Kelly, is it Kupchak?
You're so good, you didn't say cupcake.
Although cupcake sounds nice. That sounds lovely. From Oregon Tradeswomen, of course, and Yasmin Ibarra from SEIU Local 49. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Yeah, is the green light on, Marcus? There you go. Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
Well, it's good to see you all again. Thank you for welcoming us and letting us present in front of you today. My name is Marcus Mundy. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color. We are an alliance of culturally specific community-based organizations with representation from African, African-American, Asian, Latino, Middle Eastern, North African, Native American, Pacific Islander, and Slavic communities. The CCC supports a collective racial justice effort to improve outcomes for communities of color through policy analysis and advocacy, culturally appropriate data and research, environmental justice, and leadership development in communities of color. Why we're here today is that we have supported racial justice member organizations of the Healthy Communities Coalition from the very beginning, both with our members and others, for over 3 years of intentional relationship building. We invested this time to ensure as a coalition we could craft a holistic vision for the Broadway corridor alongside our labor partners, community-based organizations, and environmental groups that ensured that our interests wouldn't be pitted against one another in yet another zero-sum game exercise. That we had no interest in that. Our explicit interest is to improve outcomes for communities of color in this city and in Oregon. And we strongly support a legally binding community benefits agreement which is clear, enforceable, and changes the course of history for development in Portland, which instead of communities of color being transacted upon, we are at the table as full partners and/or conveners, shaping inclusive outcomes for all who will live, work, and play in the Broadway corridor. We bluntly reject any insinuation that the proven tool of community benefit agreements won't work in this market. As aforementioned, many other communities, both large and small, with public entities and private developments, have used CBAs to their benefit, including Nashville, Oakland, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, others, but those are just to name a few. The Broadway Corridor CBA would be the first such comprehensive agreement in our city, covering not just construction equity, but many other concerns of our communities. And we think it's about time. We're also looking forward to the following components of the vertical construction of the project, specifically affordable housing. Affordability continues to be a concern for Portland Housing Bureaus, for our members, and for communities of color in Portland. The PHB, the Portland Housing Bureau's own State of Housing report, states there are no neighborhoods in Portland affordable to single moms or to black families. I hope they include single dads too, because I was one of those. This is unacceptable, and the housing provided in these units should be affordable from 0 to 60 MFI. Environmental sustainability within the building. This building should, I would love to say must, but it certainly should include green infrastructure, energy efficient, and environmentally friendly development. And the last part, which the last panel addressed a little bit, tenanting. Business equity is key for communities of color, and we're advocating for the prioritization of MWESB businesses in this space, in addition to businesses that follow family and worker-friendly policies. The city already has some good examples of this. Your own minority contracting group does good work in this area, but we would like to see more of it. Given the history of intentional displacement of indigenous, Black, Chinese, and Japanese residents from this area, and given the city's recent acknowledgement of that intentional displacement, we at the CCC are also advocating for a racial preference to be considered for the housing units as a concrete step toward remediating these historic injustices. We affirm our ability to problem solve when we build intentional relationships with one another. We affirm our values as a community that's committed to racial justice, which is demonstrated through clear definitions of good quality jobs and maximizing the opportunities to build affordable housing and for businesses. And lastly, we look forward to supporting all aspects of this CBA, recognizing that a just outcome means that there are no sacrifice communities here and that all will have a future in Portland's newest exciting neighborhood.
Thank you, Marcus. We appreciate it.
Good afternoon. Thank you, esteemed commissioners and Mayor Wheeler. For the record, my name is Kelly Kupchak. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Tradeswomen. For the last 30 plus years, we've worked really hard to ensure that women and people of color have access and opportunity and equity in the skilled trades. We see those as a clear pathway from poverty to prosperity. And I want to take a quick moment to thank the city bureaus, as well as Kimberly and her team at Prosper, as well as the developer, for coming to the table, and the folks around the community, because this is not an easy process, right? Folks who've been in this community for much longer than I know, that it has been, come back. Thanks, Chloe. I was wondering. All right. It's not been an easy process, but it's a critical process for ensuring that folks that have been historically marginalized and have been historically excluded from a shared wealth model have access to that. And so Oregon Tradeswomen fully supports the community benefits agreement model, and we'd like to see and ensure that 4 components are included. One is that there is a project labor agreement to ensure a voice for workers and worker equity, as well as for equity and access and opportunity for minority and women-owned firms. We'd like to ensure that there is prevailing wage, and I'm sorry that Commissioner Hardesty stepped out, because I wanted to address her very important concern about that impact on small, emerging, minority and women-owned firms around prevailing wage. It's a false narrative. There is a lot of demonstrated research around the opportunity for minority contractors and women contractors to grow when they have access to supports and access to those bid packages and the ability to really grow their firms. And so prevailing wage is also to ensure that all of our workers have a fair wage, so all of our workers are lifted up, not just a few. The third piece is that there's sufficient investment into the project in terms of a set aside for reinvesting into our community. Folks have talked about this being a transformational project from a built environment perspective, from an environmental perspective. It's also really critical that that reinvestment helps our most vulnerable job seekers have access to the jobs, both on the front end for construction and at the end use jobs, as Marcus talked about, in terms of those 51,000 jobs that are projected at the end use. And that can also, that reinvestment through that set aside can also support minority and women-owned firms and emerging firms in getting the technical assistance they need, including bonding and support on bidding, so that they're not left out. Right, so they're not left out. Right now, it's my understanding that that's capped at far less than even 1%, which is a model that has been used in other communities at 1.3 million. So over 20 years, that's $65,000 a year. That's not even training 10 folks. So I just want to underscore what that investment could look like, or perhaps should look like. And then lastly, ensuring that there's strong oversight and enforcement of what the components of the community benefits agreement are, and that community is at the table. Those of us representing community, those of us that work with community to ensure that the project is living its goals and living the components of the CBA, so we're accountable to the community. And lastly, I just want to close by saying we are excited to be part of this conversation, and we see this as a model for true reinvestment and true outcomes of a shared wealth model. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for all the great work you do at Oregon Tradeswomen. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioners. My name is Yasmin. I work for SEIU Local 49. We represent around 15,000 workers in Oregon and Southwest Washington who work in janitorial, security, and healthcare, as well as other services. All too often, commercial real estate projects in Portland have been a tale of two cities: impressive office buildings for well-paid professionals and poverty jobs for janitors, security officers, and other blue-collar workers. This inequity built into our city's economy disproportionately harms people of color, women, and immigrants. Two leaders of our union recently shared their perspectives with Prosper Portland and Continuum Partners. Adela Mesa, who's over there, who has been a janitor for 20 years, as well as Linda Sporer, who's been a security officer, and both of them working in these industries for over 20 years. Both of them are here today, and I'm submitting their testimonies that they presented for your consideration. Adela and Linda described their work in the past for non-union companies where they experienced poverty wages, insufficient health insurance, or none at all, disrespect on the job, including sexual harassment, and the fear of being fired if they spoke up about such problems. They also testified about the major improvements they experienced when they organized a union, winning better wages, health insurance, and having a power to speak on the job without fear of retaliation. So for us, the Broadway Corridor represents a unique opportunity to create a new district where all jobs are good jobs. The CBA negotiations with Continuum and Prosper Portland have conceptually agreed to quality job standards for janitors and securities and investing into the community-driven oversight and enforcement. And those are two important steps forward. But things are missing. First, they have not committed to making such standards enforceable for all building owners and tenants over the life of the project. And secondly, they have not agreed to setting enforceable standards for workers doing other types of jobs. SEIU Local 49 is united with our Healthy Communities Coalition partners to make the most of this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in Broadway Corridor. We are prepared to celebrate the co-creation of a transformative approach in equitable economic development if we can reach that agreement in the coming days. But we're also prepared to hold private developers and public officials accountable if the project ends up creating more poverty jobs based on unenforceable promises. So we just want to reiterate our request that our support to you, that our central demands are equitable access to good jobs and contracting opportunities for everyone, including women and people of color, and also including fair wages and benefits and a voice on the job, sufficient resources to create career pathways, and meaningful oversight and enforcement tools. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentation. Thank you so much for the testimony from SEIU workers. I appreciate receiving that always. So you've raised a dilemma for me.
Okay.
How do I make private developers do anything? I have no authority over private developers who own their own land and are going to build whatever it is they're going to build. What has been the conversation with the committee about how does that happen, right?
Yeah.
Because, okay, I'm with you. Let's say we could do it. We can't. Legally, we cannot do it. So what's the next best thing?
Yeah, if I can bring
Here comes
up
Vivian.
She's on
She's
the
got an
committee.
answer.
And Vivian, the mic just slides over there. There you go. If you could reintroduce yourself for the record, just so the closed captioners can
Let me
hear it.
reintroduce myself. My name is Vivian Satterfield of the Healthy Communities Coalition. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for representing so many of our interests here. Commissioner Hardesty, I appreciate the question. That's explicitly why community benefit agreements, so I want to be clear, CBAs isn't just alphabet soup. It is a legally binding agreement that the community negotiates in a three-party agreement with the private developer and with the public agency in order to formally codify in legal language and contracts the language to hold them accountable. And that's why there were so many CBA experts being brought into the process to inform precisely that concern of how you can hold private developers accountable. And that's why we're at the negotiating table.
So basically, it is an agreement that's reached between all parties at the front end, right? And then it gives us the tools to go back and say, us, the policymakers, the tools to go back and say, well, you agreed to this when we started, and now we're here, and now we need corrective action. Is that inaccurate?
Correct. It's legally binding, and the corrective action is also laid out in those terms, including keeping potentially, potentially the door open for other future corrective actions that could be available. I know in the state of Oregon, we have many preemptions, so.
Yes, we do. Yeah, gotta love it, huh? Thank you very much. That's very helpful, because we need to know what our options are, like in full. So I appreciate the ongoing conversation, and I know we'll be meeting to talk more about this. So thank you all so much.
I look forward to that. Thank you.
Mayor.
Commissioner Daly.
Thank you for that, Vivian. I just want one more point of clarification. It's because there's publicly owned land and perhaps other kind of subsidies and perks that will be given or contributed to this project that we're able to do the CBA. We couldn't compel a private developer on private property to do this, right? Well, unless they were receiving benefits.
Yeah, so I think, and I'd love also the opportunity to come to each of these offices and talk a little bit more about the tool of CBAs. The reason, it's not necessarily only because there's public dollars available in the project. I mean, the exchange that's made in the community benefits agreement, and what I inferred in my comments, is that the community agrees as signatories to not protest the project. So there actually is an exchange in order to receive those community benefits. And so a developer could choose, even without the public agency's involvement, to do that, which results in work stoppages and whatnot. But there's many different models for how that happens, and we're working with our technical advisors as to how best to make that hook.
But as far as us being able to compel anything, it's because of our stake in the project. Yeah.
At this moment, yes.
Yeah. Mr. Mundy, we could talk about this offline because I know we're going a little over time, but I just want to put a couple questions on the record. You stated a desire to see some kind of racial preference policy in the housing. How do we do that without running afoul of fair housing laws? And if that's a really long answer, we should talk about it later.
It's a long answer. I'd like to say, yes, we can talk about it later, but not to be non-transparent, just because it's a full conversation and it's specific remediation. And I know they've talked about it a little bit on the committee as well, so.
I mean, I certainly understand the intent and desire, and not saying I'm not supportive, but most concerned with, not violating
And that would be a more
federal
focused
laws.
remediation for the
Okay.
people who were specifically displaced,
All right.
communities that were specifically
And then Kelly, I'm really interested in the prevailing wage conversation as well. I think I share some of Commissioner Hardesty's concerns, and I really want to make sure I understand it. And again, it's probably a conversation we could have
Absolutely.
some other
Thank you,
time. But I
thank you,
did have
Commissioner
one
Daly.
question. I mean, as a former small business owner, I know that there are cost advantages linked to the scale of operation. It's just simply more expensive for small businesses to perform certain services or functions than a large business. So, I mean, that's what I'm trying to get to.
Certainly, and that's a good question, and it's an important consideration. And again, I appreciate that Commissioner Hardesty raised that earlier, and I'm sorry you were out of the room when I tried to address that in a small piece. But certainly, on the front end for construction, it's an opportunity to level the playing field for all contractors who are bidding. There are other mechanisms that can be put into place to assure and ensure that small firms, emerging firms, disadvantaged firms, minority firms, and women-owned firms aren't waiting for a month for payroll to come in. There are opportunities to ensure that those set-asides are providing the technical assistance they need to even bid and understand back-of-the-house issues or have access to bonding. And that's not my area of expertise, but I do want to say there's a lot of research that demonstrates prevailing wage is really critical, and it's not a burden, in fact, if it's done right and it's done with those supports to small firms. And it really is truly important for us to lift up those wages for all folks. I mean, when I think about the conversation about affordable housing and the folks that we serve, and the fastest way for them to get secure housing and to be, fully living in this community and thriving is through a good job with a good wage and benefits. We are not going to do that if we continue to low road.
Yeah. All right. So
And
we just have
we're
to-
happy to follow up and provide that research and have other additional conversations if that's beneficial.
We just have to make sure that we do it right.
Yes,
Yep.
and
Commissioner Hardesty.
thank you so much for those questions, Commissioner Udaley, because for me, James Posey and I have worked on this issue for almost 25 years straight in this chamber, right? And it has played out over and over again at a disadvantage to very small firms. And so I don't want to reinforce the status quo. And the status quo right now means that there are a lot of small minority and women-owned firms who don't get the opportunity to grow because of that barrier, right? But again, I didn't hear anybody talk about how do we bond? How do we, the city, or Prosper Portland or somebody create a bonding mechanism so that is a barrier that's removed. Right now, today, if you're a pre-apprenticeship, you're paying into a union that you don't get a benefit at all unless one day maybe you make it to journeyman status. And so so when we have people in training, we've got to understand that we have people in training and we're growing businesses. And if we want those businesses to grow, they can't be competing at the exact same level as the big companies. And so we just have to figure out how to do it and do it right. The city has not figured out how to do it right yet. And I don't want us to miss the opportunity with this project.
So let's let that be the final word. Obviously, there is a ton of information here, a ton of great ideas put on the table. This is an update report. All of this is to be continued. And I want to underscore how much we appreciate everybody's participation and comments today. And I heard a lot of intersections in terms of the values that we all share. Commissioner Fritz?
I just had one comment. Thank you all, everybody who's here. And thank you, Mayor, for setting up a really true discussion of
it was
all
interesting.
different sides and many different perspectives, thanks to Prosper and the Housing Bureau. What's, I think, good is that we're all want the same outcomes and that we're all looking forward to the opportunities that are presented here. So thank you, Mayor, for setting this up like this.
Thank you, Commissioner. And with that, I'll entertain a motion.
I move the, what is it?
Move to accept the report.
Okay.
Accept the report.
Sorry.
We just followed over each other.
Long day.
But nobody seconded it.
I second it.
Okay, so Commissioner Udaley, we're going to actually give you the motion. We're going to give
I got the
Commissioner
motion,
Hardesty the
yeah.
second. And Commissioner Fritz and I will just go along gladly. Carla, please call the roll.
Fritz,
Thanks again. Aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Udaley.
Thanks, everybody. It's exciting possibilities and important conversations. I vote aye.
Wheeler.
This is a fantastic, big vision, and I love the fact that it's starting with the values. It's starting with the values of inclusion. It's starting with the values of shared economic prosperity. It's starting with the values of creating a world-class example of sustainability. It's starting with a value of creating a space that everybody sees themselves in. And I'm really excited about this going forward and continuing with all the great work that who testified and everybody in this room has been engaged in. To the future, I vote aye. The report's accepted. And now, colleagues, I'm going to turn the gavel over to the Council President.
Could we
as I
take a
have to go.
5-minute break, please, Madam President?
Absolutely. We'll take a 5-minute break, Carla. back in order, and we are going to, the first order is to refer item 82 back to Commissioner Udaley's office.
Yes, do we need to read that, or?
I think we're okay without
Okay.
reading it.
Are we
Thank
okay
you.
without reading the title?
Yes.
Okay, heads are nodding up and down.
Thank you.
Okay, item 83, please.
83, appeal of the Portland Japanese Garden against the hearing officer's decision of approval with conditions limiting the garden's office use in the house at 369 Southwest Kingston Avenue to 4 years, LU 19-192268CU.
Can I have the city attorney make announcements about today's hearing, please?
Yes. This is an on-the-record hearing. This means you must limit your testimony to material and issues in the record. We will begin with a staff report by Bureau of Development Services staff for approximately 10 minutes. Following staff report, the City Council will hear from interested persons in the following order. The appellant will go first and have 10 minutes to present their case. Following the appellant, persons who support the appeal will go next. Each of those persons will have 3 minutes to speak to the council. The principal opponent will then have 15 minutes to address council and rebut the appellant's presentation. After the principal opponent, council will hear from persons who oppose the appeal. Again, each will have 3 minutes. And finally, the appellant will have 5 minutes to rebut the presentation of the opponents of the appeal. The council may then close the hearing, deliberate, and take a vote on the appeal. If the vote is a tentative vote, the council will set a future date for the adoption of findings and a final vote on the appeal. If council takes a final vote today, that will conclude the matter before council. There are several guidelines for those who will be addressing council on an on-the-record hearing. First, the evidentiary record is closed. If the hearing is to decide only if the hearings officer made the correct decision based on the evidence presented to him. This means you must limit your remarks to arguments based on the record compiled by the hearings officer. You may refer to evidence that was previously submitted to the hearings officer. You may not submit new evidence today that was not submitted to the hearings officer. If your argument includes new evidence or issues, you may be interrupted and reminded that you must limit your testimony to the record. The council will not consider the new information, and it will be rejected in the council's final decision. Second, objections to new evidence. If you believe a person who addressed council today improperly presented new evidence or presented a legal argument relying on evidence that is not in the record, you may object to that argument. Third, objections to new issues. Under state law, only issues raised before the hearings officer may be raised in this appeal to council. If you believe another person has raised issues today that were not raised before the hearings officer, you may object to the council's consideration of that issue. Fourth, the applicant must identify constitutional challenges to conditions of approval. If the applicant fails to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval with enough specificity to allow council to respond, the applicant will be precluded from bringing an action for damages in circuit court. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you. Do any council members wish to declare a conflict of interest?
I'm a member of the Japanese Garden, but I don't think that constitutes a conflict of interest.
No, I don't think so either. Legal counsel, is that accurate?
That is correct.
I also have no conflict. Does any member of the council have ex parte contact to declare or information gathered outside of this hearing to disclose?
I was in charge of Portland Parks and Recreation from 2013 to 2017, and therefore had some knowledge of the previous proceedings regarding this area.
So I will take that as that no council members have had ex parte communication.
I have not had any discussions about this particular case.
Thank you. In that case, moving forward.
You may want to ask about whether there are any site visits.
Yes, has any member of the council gone on a site visit to observe this property outside of any process? All heads are shaking no. I would add my no shaking head to that. And so now it is my role to call for testimony. We will start with the staff report, and staff will have 10 minutes to do their report. Please come up to the podium, introduce yourself, and you may begin. Before you start, I have one more question I'm supposed to ask my colleagues, and that question is, do any council members have any other matters that we need to discuss before we start the hearing?
Oh, that's a completely different
Wow.
question.
I know, isn't it? I was like, hey, I'm just following the rules here. No? No. Okay, so we're all good. Thank you so much. Please, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I am Andy Galizia. I'm a planner with the Bureau of Development Services. This is an appeal hearing for a Type 3 conditional use review. The Portland Japanese Garden is the applicant, and the applicant's proposal is to continue using the house at 369 Southwest Kingston Avenue, referred to as the Kingston House, as administrative office space for the Japanese Garden for 10 years. After a public hearing, the hearings officer approved the conditional use review with a condition of approval limiting the office use to 4 more years rather than the 10 years the applicant had requested. The Portland Japanese Garden has appealed to City Council to reconsider the hearings officer's condition of approval, and my role here today is to present the hearings officer's decision. So this is the zoning map. This area here is the portion of Washington Park which contains the Portland Japanese Garden. This area is zoned OS, or open space. The subject of this application is this property here, which is labeled Kingston House on this map. This is zoned R7 residential. In 2009, the Japanese Garden obtained conditional use review approval to add the Kingston House to the garden's conditional use site and to allow the Kingston House to be used as administrative offices for the garden for a period of 10 years. And the applicant's current proposal is to continue using the Kingston House as Japanese Garden offices for 10 more years. The applicant is not proposing any physical changes to the property or any changes to the scale of the existing office use. So this is an aerial photograph of the area. The Kingston House property is here, outlined in blue. To the south of the Kingston House is the portion of Japanese Park, or of Washington Park rather, that is occupied by the Japanese Garden. Across the street from the Japanese Garden land here are the Washington Park tennis courts, and other properties which abut the Kingston House property are developed with single-family homes. This is a photograph of the Kingston House property viewed from Southwest Kingston Avenue. This is a photograph looking into Washington Park from Southwest Kingston Avenue, directly in front of the Kingston House property. On the left side of the street here are the Washington Park tennis courts, and on the right side of the street is land occupied by the Portland Japanese Garden. This is a view looking across Southwest Kingston Avenue from the Kingston House. This is just looking at another single-family home. And this is a view looking north into the residential neighborhood from the sidewalk in front of the Kingston House property. So I'm going to summarize the hearings officer's findings for the applicable conditional use approval criteria. Criterion A is the proportion of household living uses. This criterion requires that the overall residential appearance and function of the residential area will not be significantly lessened due to an increased proportion of non-residential uses. For purposes of this criterion, the hearings officer considered the residential area to be residentially zoned lots near the Kingston House, not including Washington Park, which is zoned open space rather than residential. The hearings officer found the proportion of non-residential uses on residentially zoned lots in the area is small, and the hearings officer found that approval criterion A was met with conditions of approval to limit the intensity and scale of the office use. These include limiting the use to weekdays only, limiting regular office hours to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., requiring any meetings to conclude by 9:30 p.m., and limiting the maximum occupancy of the house to 12 people at any one time. Criterion B is for physical compatibility, specifically that the proposed use will be compatible with adjacent residential developments in appearance and scale. The hearings officer noted the Kingston House still has the outward appearance of a house, and the applicant is not proposing any physical changes to the house or grounds. The hearings officer found the proposal would be physically compatible with the adjacent residential area and that approval criterion B was met. Criterion C is livability, and this criterion requires there to be no significant adverse impacts on the livability of nearby residentially zoned lands. For purposes of this criterion, the hearings officer used the dictionary definition of the word significant as having or likely to influence or affect, and of a noticeably or measurably large amount. The hearings officer noted that he had approved the 2009 conditional use review because livability impacts from the proposed office use were deemed to not be significant if the use was temporary and limited to 10 years, which was what was proposed by the applicant at that time. The hearings officer also noted that the applicant indicated they intend to continue searching for alternative locations for office space within the next 10 years, but they focused on the possible construction of new office space within Washington Park, where such development would be subject to substantial constraints and uncertainty. So the hearings officer found that if 10 more years of office use in the Kingston House were approved, the use of the Kingston House as office space would essentially be permanent, and that the applicant was likely to request another extension in 2029 because efforts to construct additional office space in Washington Park may not be successful. The hearings officer found that impacts from office use are fundamentally different from residential uses, and that this residential neighborhood is particularly sensitive to any increased impacts from non-residential uses because of its location adjacent to major activity centers in Washington Park. So the hearings officer found criterion C could be met only by imposing a condition of approval limiting the continued office use in the Kingston House to 4 more years rather than the 10 years the applicant requested. The hearings officer found 4 years would be sufficient for the Japanese Garden to find alternative office space if they broadened their search parameters beyond areas within walking distance of the garden. Criterion D is for adequacy of public services. The Portland Bureau of Transportation found the transportation system is adequate to support the office use in the Kingston House along with other uses in the area. The Water Bureau and the Bureau of Environmental Services responded with no concerns about the existing water and sewer connections and stormwater disposal. And the Police and Fire Bureaus also reviewed the proposal and responded with no objections. So the hearings officer found that public services are adequate for the proposed use and that criterion D is met. The city's 2035 comprehensive plan was appealed, and while that appeal has been pending, certain land use applications, including this one, must be found to be consistent with the Oregon statewide planning goals. Statewide Planning Goal 10 requires local governments to plan for and accommodate needed housing. The hearings officer noted that imposing a 4-year time limit on the office use in the Kingston House is supportive of Goal 10 because presumably after the 4 years, the house would return to residential use. So the hearings officer approved the conditional use review with 8 conditions of approval. The first is that the approval would expire in 4 years. Condition B is that regular office hours are limited to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. weekdays. Condition C, meetings must be held on weekdays, must end by 9:30 p.m., and must be limited to 12 attendees. D, the maximum occupancy of the house is limited to 12 people at any one time, including regular office staff and meeting attendees. Condition E, the exterior of the house must retain the appearance of a private residence. Condition F, no signage is allowed except for address identification and small signs near the front door. Condition G, the applicant must provide the neighborhood association with contact information for any after-hours security concerns. And Condition H, parking associated with the Kingston House must be on the property with up to 2 vehicles on the Kingston House driveway at a time or in the park. Parking associated with the Kingston House office use would not be allowed on the residential street. So the applicant appealed the hearings officer's decision based on objections to condition of approval A, which limits the duration of the office use in the house to 4 more years. So the applicant's appeal request is to modify the hearings officer's decision to extend the conditional use approval from 4 more years to 10 more years. And there are 3 alternatives facing City Council in this hearing. One is to deny the appeal and uphold the hearings officer's findings and conditions of approval, including the condition of approval limiting the office use to 4 more years. The second is to deny the appeal and uphold the hearings officer's decision limiting the office use to 4 more years, but with modified conditions or findings. And the third alternative is to grant the appeal and modify the hearings officer's findings and conditions to allow office use for more than 4 years, up to a maximum of 10 years, which is what the applicant has requested. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Fritz?
Thank you for that very clear presentation. Is there anything in the approval criteria for conditional uses that says they have to be temporary?
No.
Thank you.
Commissioner
Madam President,
Udaley?
thank you. You went over livability, like potential livability issues. Have there been any livability issues caused by the use of this home in the last 10 years?
Opponents of the application at the hearings officer's hearing submitted evidence that there's been increases in crime and nuisances in the area. They would argue that some of that is attributable to the office use in the Kingston House. There's also a concern about the fact that the Kingston House is not occupied by a family. At night and on weekends, it's not occupied by anyone, so it creates a sort of a dead zone at the end of the residential street, fewer eyes on the street to deter crime and nuisances.
So it's not that people coming to the house to do the business of the Japanese garden are committing crimes or causing nuisance. It's because the house is not occupied the rest of the time?
I believe that's an accurate
Okay.
characterization of neighbors' concerns, yes.
Could you tell Commissioner Daly what the hearings officer said about that? What the findings are?
The hearings officer's findings about livability was really focused on the fact that this neighborhood is unique in that it is next to major activity centers, the Rose Garden, the Japanese Garden, the tennis courts, and they're already feeling a lot of impacts from that. And so they're especially sensitive to any other impacts from non-residential uses. So the hearings officer found that impacts from office use are just fundamentally different. He didn't point to anything, any particular impact that has happened as that part of that analysis, just that office use is different from residential use by nature, and that this neighborhood is especially sensitive to differences in impacts and characteristics.
Yeah, I can imagine differences in impacts, but also on the plus side, you don't have neighbors that are making any noise at night, so there's that.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll have the appellant come up next, and the appellant has 10 minutes as well. Please introduce yourself for the record, please.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Robert Zagunis, and I'm currently serving in a volunteer capacity as the chair of the Board of the Trustees of the Portland Japanese Garden. And I've been a resident of Portland for over 50 years and most recently retired as a principal from a local investment management firm, Jensen Investment Management. So on behalf of the Portland Japanese Garden, I want to thank you first for the time today to hear this appeal. We know that our city and each of you have many more important issues demanding of your time and attention, so we will make this as brief as possible. The garden, as was stated, owns the house in the Arlington Heights neighborhood that is immediately adjacent to the entrance of Washington Park on Southwest Kingston and contiguous to the Japanese Garden. And since 2009, we have operated under this 10-year conditional use permit as workspace for up to 12 individuals. This spring, we applied for another 10-year conditional use. In December, the conditional use permit was granted by the hearings, but with a 4-year time limit. We appreciate that the conditional use permit had been renewed, but we are, as was indicated, concerned about the length of time of this, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. To be clear, we are here appealing the 4-year time limit and asking for more time. The garden has 138 employees plus 300 volunteers. Unfortunately, we are short of space on our 12.5-acre campus to provide adequate workspace for all of them. And 10 years ago, when we purchased the house at 369 Kingston, which is right next to the entrance, and right diagonally across from the tennis court, we purchased the house in order to use as an interim workspace for our staff and volunteers until we knew what our permanent expansion plan would look like. At that time, in 2009, we did not request a permanent conditional use permit because we hoped that our expansion project, which was then in its very early stages, would be able to create enough workspace for staff and volunteers. And during those 10 years, our staff has worked quietly in the house without disrupting neighbors. and pursuant to the original conditional use permit, we have maintained the exterior of the house in its original residential form, have maintained the grounds to keep it consistent with the residential neighborhood. We have no signage on the house indicating that it's anything other than a residence. And deliveries for the house, which are for garden purposes, are actually made not there in the neighborhood, but up at the garden itself. Since our garden is open 7 days a week all year long, we always have at least one employee working in the house on any given day. This does provide extra eyes and ears in the street, even as several of the other nearby houses are unoccupied for large parts of the year. In addition, we have a 24-hour security staff who check on the house during the night to provide additional safety. We do require staff members who work in the Kingston House to park either in the house's driveway or within Washington Park. We also require that the other 126 staff not park in the neighborhood, and we are vigilant in enforcing this. On occasion, when one of our employees does transgress and our neighbor reports this to us, we immediately take action and prevent it from reoccurring. We know that some of our neighbors do like aspects of the operation of the garden itself, and we work diligently to accommodate those concerns to the extent possible. However, I need to take this opportunity to say that those issues, from lights to leaf blowers, are all related to the garden property and are not related in any way to how we use this house on Kingston Avenue. So why are we asking for your help today? Well, for the past 5 years, we strenuously tried to get Portland Parks and Recreation collaboratively solve our mutual need for additional workspace for both their and our staff volunteers who work in Washington Park. 2 years ago, we met with some of you and testified here at City Council in opposition of the Washington Park Master Plan. We had two primary issues then: access for park visitors and workspace for our staff and volunteers. The cultural institutions in Washington Park all felt that Portland Parks and Recreation had failed to address access, which was the primary problem the master plan was supposed to address. As a result, you and your predecessors on City Council required that the master plan be contingent upon first completing a comprehensive transportation management plan. That plan is going to cost as much as the original master plan. As such, it has taken us working diligently with all the primary stakeholders in Washington Park 18 months to negotiate the funding mechanism for that planning process, and we are just now starting that process, which is expected to take another 18 months. I'm telling you this to give you a picture on how the wheels of progress do move forward, but they do move exceptionally slowly. When you go through the right process and are working in Portland's premier park with 5 cultural institutions, multiple departments with Portland Parks, multiple city bureaus, metro, residential neighbors, all whom are dedicated to serving over 3.5 million members of our community and visitors to our community each year. So what does this have to do with our appeal? 2 things. The prior leadership of Portland Parks and Recreation completely stonewalled us on the need for staffing and volunteer workspace within Washington Park. While they might point out allocating over $12 million for new workspace for park staff, many of whom don't even work in Washington Park, there was a pretense of public process, but actual input from the cultural institutions who are responsible for serving most of the park's visitors was ignored, and that's what brings us here today. Fortunately, the new director of Portland Parks and Recreation, Adina Long, is a breath of fresh air and is willing to work with us on a mutual solution. However, a 4-year limit on the conditional use permit is a very compressed time frame for both developing and implementing a solution. To even get started on this, the Washington Park stakeholders have to complete the transportation management plan, which will, in turn, identify locations within the park that would be best for siting the new workspace for Portland Park staff, and it is those sites that Director Long and we believe could be built through sharing costs to provide workspace for both Portland Parks and Japanese Garden staff. Once we identify those sites, Portland Parks and City Council will need to decide on the optimal timing for a bond measure, which may take several years. And that's not all. Then there will be a design process followed by construction. Our own expansion project, which we completed in 2017, required 5 years to design, fund, and construct. Using that as a timeline, even if we had all the positions to start tomorrow, the 4-year time limit on the conditional use permit would expire before we could complete such a project. And I know what you might be thinking is that we could just come back for another conditional use permit in 4 years. But my last point here is to point out that the Japanese Garden is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to serving the community. The conditional use permit process has already cost us close to $40,000. It costs $12,000 just in application fees payable to the city. So the specter of having to return to this expensive process in just 4 years is truly daunting to us. Please help us continue to share the most renowned Japanese garden in the world outside of Japan with our community. Please extend the 4-year time limit on the conditional use permit. Please support Portland Parks and Recreation Director Adina Long in finding a mutually beneficial way to create a real workspace solution for Portland Parks, for the Japanese Garden, and the others who make Washington Park so special. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, any questions? Commissioner Udaley?
Well, you answered my number one question, which is why this space wasn't accommodated for in the expansion plan. It sounds like it would just be too big of an impact on the existing park.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Just, there is some office space in the new facility, but wasn't enough to accommodate the level of people that we need.
And as Transportation Commissioner, I just want to commiserate with you about how slow those wheels turn. So I understand the timeline stress you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fitz? And so I do have a question.
Yes.
My question has to do with when you got the 10-year extension, there was a period of time that you then realized that the Parks Bureau was not going to be able to partner with you. What prevented you from going off and doing whatever you needed to do on your own without actually waiting for the Parks Bureau to actually step up and work with you? 10 years is a long time to be waiting for somebody to partner with you.
Correct. Well, we did start working with that. I think the part of it you can say is on us because we had a big $37 million project that we were in the middle of during those first 10 years that the conditional use permit was going on. So a lot of the attention was going on to that, and the development of that project with the expectation that it would have more space was ongoing. And it was finally at the end when we were, basically finished with the project a couple years ago that it was clear to us that there was not space enough, that we needed it. And so consequently, the Kingston House, which really is a relatively small house at the end of the street, looks like any other house in the neighborhood, became a place that could provide some of the support or relieve the pressure for some of the staff that we have.
Okay.
So part of it was on us in timing.
I appreciate you saying that because I'm like, okay, so you were building a space, but you built it too small, and now you want the Parks Bureau to partner with you, and they didn't come back quick enough. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
No, I think the aspect for space is basically trying to, with the master plan, making sure that it's not just the Portland Japanese Garden, but the zoo and everybody else that's in the area there, trying to help solve, the comprehensive issue of space, really, for whether it's parking or even office space. And it's a problem right now. I think it will get a little bit worse going forward if we don't address it. And the point that we're trying to make is that, 4 years to try to get that resolved, no matter what's going on, isn't long enough to be able to accomplish what we're trying to do.
Madam
Commissioner
President,
Fritz?
I noticed the city attorney looking anxious. No?
No, she's good?
Okay.
No, she's really good at, no. She will let me know. My seat will start buzzing. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Supporters of the appeal can come up. They will have 3 minutes each. If we have, how many do we have by show of hands? Please come on up. We got room for 3?
We have a sign-up sheet.
I only show 2 people signed up, Steve Bloom and Dory Vollum.
Thank you. Please put your name for the public record, and you have 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Bloom. I'm the CEO of the Portland Japanese Garden, and I think I may have some further clarification to some of your questions, too, in my testimony here. And first of all, I wanted to express our condolences for the passing of Nick. He was a great supporter of parks and of the garden in particular, and we worked with him very closely over these years, and what a great loss, so our condolences. Please bear with me as I give some background about the Portland Japanese Garden, which has been in the park for now 57 years serving the citizens of Portland. And I've have the privilege of the last 14 years serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the organization. We were founded by the citizens of Portland as a gesture of peace and reconciliation in the aftermath of World War II. Generations of Portlanders have been coming to this garden for experiences of peace and beauty for years. We've always been a nonprofit governed by the Board of Trustees comprised of citizens like our board president, Robert, who you heard from, the garden's trustees, staff, and generations of volunteers have always been passionate about this world-class asset for Portland. This year, the Portland Japanese Garden will serve almost 500,000 people. About half of those people come from every corner of Portland, of our community, and the other half come from 85 countries from around the United States and 85 countries from around the world. We actually strive to serve underrepresented parts of our community through partnerships with Title I schools, access admission and membership programs, and partnerships with local social service organizations like Big Brothers and Sisters. In addition, the garden has 21,000 members and 300 volunteers. We have 138 employees, and we have been a leader in the nonprofit section, making sure that our starting wage is at $15 per hour, and we pay 100% health premiums for our full-time employees. In June, we're hosting the International Conference of American Public Gardens, which will bring over 1,200 people from the field to Portland. We're very proud of the expansion, which opened in 2017, but because of the number of people that we are serving, we found that the size of the expansion was not big enough, and we are cornered in. There is nowhere else for us to go in the 12.5 acres. We made the deliberate decision that we were going to make a priority to use that limited space we had for public space that the public could access, and that was a better use of the property than for offices. So while we added some office space, we gave priority to public space that the citizens could use. Portland Parks and Recreation, as we said, we were working on a solution. It did not work out. We were also working on a solution with Portland Parks. That did not work out. And so now we want to have time to go back to the drawing board now that we are given an indication by Portland Parks and Rec that they are willing to work with us on a solution within the park. Proximity is everything. The people who can work off-site do work off-site. We have offices on Sylvan Hill.
Mr. I'm sorry, we have a very strict time limit, so I do have to stop you when your time is up. Thank you very much. Please, name for the record.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Dory Vollum. And prior to Robert Zagunis, I was board president for 2 years, and I was also the chairperson of the $37.5 million capital campaign for the expansion. When I joined the board, I knew how important the garden was to me personally and to our community, but I had not imagined that I would ever become its chief fundraiser and advocate. As a citizen, I've been heartened over the years by the many times that I've worked with Portland Parks, the Water Bureau, the Planning Bureau to help us find a way forward in our complicated and expensive expansion. Without that expansion, our world-class garden would have been adversely impacted by the huge increase in number of people who come to visit it for unique beauty. So I commend the many people in our city's bureaus and your offices who strive to make our city work. Thank you for that. However, occasionally I've been a bit frustrated, and this is maybe a little bit one of those occasions. We just need enough time and a continued commitment from Portland Parks in order to find a win-win solution for accommodating Portland Parks and Rec and the garden staff within Washington Park. The right long-term solution for the people who are essential to maintaining the beautiful amenities of Washington Park, from the Rose Garden to the Hoyt Arboretum, the Holocaust Memorial, Sacagawea statue, et cetera, and our Japanese garden, is with your help. We know that reaching out and involving all the necessary stakeholders for the right process, the public process, will require more than 4 years. Please extend the 4-year limit on this conditional use permit. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you both.
Thank you.
Have to speak in a hurry for those 3 minutes.
Yes, it's intimidating when you aren't accustomed to having a time limit, right? Thank you. Now we will hear from principal opponents. Do you have a list, caller? Are they just?
There's a principal opponent.
A principal opponent, okay, thank you. Please. You will have 15 minutes total. Thank you. Please introduce yourself for the record.
My name is Steve Janik. I'm representing Joe Angel, who lives across the street from the Kingston House, and I'm attorney, 101 Southwest Main, Portland. The Kingston House, as you know, is in the comp plan as residential, and it's zoned residential. In 2009, the applicant applied for the 10-year conditional use for offices. Prior to and in preparation for the major expansion of the Japanese garden, a permanent conditional use was not requested. Rather than opposing that request, my client and the Neighborhood Association were very concerned about the impacts of having, in effect, an office building there. And they're also concerned about the impacts of the construction that was going to go on for a number of years in the expansion. But rather than oppose the conditional use permit, and in recognition of the public benefit that the Japanese garden provides, we decided to try to negotiate an amicable resolution in the matter. We recognize that cooperation was, in this case, appropriate. So we ended up reaching an agreement on a restrictive covenant that was signed and recorded, and we also reached agreement on a good neighbor agreement. The restrictive covenant, and I'm quoting here, said, "The intent of the parties is that the property will not be used as office space after 10 years." And in a letter I submitted to each of your offices yesterday and into the record today, when I give you these quotes, there are specific references to where in the record those quotes can be found. So in 2009, the hearings officer, Mr. Frank, given in part perhaps because we didn't oppose it, what he said then was, I think, relevant to today's hearing. Quote, "The hearings officer measured the intensity and scale of the proposed use as those flowing from only a 10-year term. The hearings officer notes that had this proposal not included a 10-year term, the hearings officer may have arrived at a conclusion that the overall residential appearance and function of the residential area would have been significantly lessened, and therefore the approval criteria would not have been met. As such, with the representation by the applicant that the house and the subject site would be used for administrative purposes for only a period of 10 years, the hearings officer finds that the overall residential appearance and function of the residential area will not be significantly lessened. The hearings officer finds with the 10-year term, this approval criteria is met," end of quote. Well, 10 years later, here we are again, and we're before Mr. Frank, the hearings officer, who was there in 2009, and now with the City Council, with the applicant seeking another 10 years. The primary approval criteria was the same 10 years ago as it is today. 33-815-105A requires proof that the overall appearance and function of the area will not be significantly lessened. In this 2019 case, the hearings officer found the following facts. In the last 10 years, the applicant has only looked for office space alternatives within Washington Park. Number two, the applicant has blamed the Parks Bureau for not allowing alternative office space in Washington Park. Number three, the applicant did not prove that its alternative public space, its alternative office space must be in Washington Park. And the applicant did not look for alternative office space in more traditional nearby office space markets. However, at the hearing, a representative of the applicant testified that the applicant, in fact, is actually renting office space near the Sylvan Interchange for administrative functions, which, as we understand it, are the functions that occur in the Kingston House. In the 2019 present case, the hearings officer decision was as follows. The hearings officer finds that granting an additional 10-year extension allowing the applicant to use the Kingston House for office use in this unique residential area will adversely impact the residential area. The hearings officer finds the use of the Kingston House as office space has meaning to residential area. The hearings officer finds the use of the Kingston House as office space will have or likely have influence or effect upon the residential area. The hearings officer finds granting the applicant's requested 10-year extension will result in, quote, significant adverse office use impacts on the residential area. Now, in 2009, the hearings officer warned that, quote, as long as the applicant continues to prefer focus upon relocating office space in Washington Park, it will be difficult to confidently predict when such an office alternative space will succeed. The hearings officer concluded that another 10-year extension would likely make the applicant reapply in 2009 for yet another extension. And this would amount to, as he described it, a, quote, permanent institutionalized office use in a residential zone.
Excuse me, I want to be mindful of the time. We have 4 minutes and 30 seconds left, and there are 3 of you, so I just
I'm
want
about to wrap up.
It's 9 minutes.
It's 15 minutes.
Oh, my bad. I'm so sorry. It's me, not you.
No problem.
I only, the top was chopped off. My apologies.
No problem. If I-
Continue.
What the hearings officer said was that if this is continued in 10-year increments, it will permanently institutionalize office space in a residential zone inconsistent with the zoning code and the comprehensive plan. Mr. Angel and the Neighborhood Association trusted the applicant. We supported their efforts. We supported the 10-year conditional use. And thereafter, we dealt with the impacts in the neighborhood with the substantial construction, additional traffic, additional people, and other problems, because the Japanese Garden is a very valuable and important institution. In this case, when we went before the hearings officer last month, we even offered a 2-year extension so that they'd have 2 years to find additional space. When the hearings officer said 4 years, we didn't appeal that. We said, okay, fine, we'll put up with the situation for another 4 years. But 4 years is a long time. We request that you affirm the hearings officer's well-reasoned decision and help the Japanese Garden find an alternative office location, and hopefully in Washington Park. What we're talking about, again, is space for 12 people. We think the hearings officer struck a very good balance between our concerns and the needs of the Japanese Garden with the decision for 4 years. And the reality is that if after their good efforts and the cooperation of the city, they can't find space in 4 years, then we can have a continuation of this discussion at that time, rather than giving them 10 years. The hearings officer said that the 4-year period of time would give them enhanced incentive to solve the problem within that period of time, rather than taking yet another 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Jeff Kleinman, 1207 Southwest 6th, 97204. I'm here on behalf of the Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association. To my right is the president, Kathy Godell. Excuse me. I'm just going to take a minute or two to leave time for Kathy, but I want to emphasize that the original, based on a review of the record, the original conditional use would not have been allowed because it didn't meet the then or current criteria. But on the assurance that the project within the garden to build office space, which was about to start, would be wrapped up and would accommodate the office space, all the opponents withdrew their opposition. And as Steve said, the hearings officer recognized that and said, okay, well, all right, but just for the 10 years. Now they're back and they want another 10 years. The effect of that is to create a permanent use, which is really what they want. The 4 years is more than generous, and we would have to be concerned about the precedent then. Steve and I have not really argued the legal case that was made before the hearings officer. This is not really an allowable conditional use, but allowing it would be a precedent for converting housing stock to office use in the city, which is about the worst thing we could do in light of the current housing crisis. It's a pathetic precedent. And I think the hearings officer was quite generous in allowing 4 years. The neighbors were agreeable to 2, proposed 2, just to give these folks more time. And we would submit that that's what the council should go back to, is a 2-year extension. There is no assurance that there will be more building of offices in the park. It is not our understanding that that's what the Parks Bureau is contemplating, whether for the garden or anybody else, including themselves. There's a transportation master plan that's out there, but at least we understand that there is no proposal for offices to occupy part of our precious parkland. These folks do have offices at the Sylvan exit. It is time for the office space to return to what it is, which is a house, and add back to the housing stock of the city of Portland. And with that, I'll have the testimony from Ms. Godell.
So I'm Kathy Gettle, and I'm representing Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association. We support the hearings officer, Gregory Frank, to limit the Japanese garden to 4 years use of the office. He was there for all the other hearings, so he had all the other background. We praise the Japanese garden for being a major asset for cultural and scenic life, but this is not about the Japanese garden. It's about office use of a residential home on a residential street as an administrative office. The livability of our neighborhood is not the same as it was 10 years ago. This land use exception needs to be viewed in today's context, not because it was approved 10 years ago when we had the full support of our neighborhood association and goodwill. The key question is, does extending the office use of this R7 residential home for 20 years have an impact on neighbors? We agree with the hearings officer, it most certainly does. Okay. So again, we request that you deny this appeal. They promised us that the use of this house would be temporary and limited to 10 years. That's from our board minutes in 2009. 4 years now is ample time for the Japanese garden to find a new office. We had recommended 2. The hearings officer found that granting another 10 would make it effectively permanent. It should be a residential home. We're a residential neighborhood. In our neighborhood, this is the same diagram that Andy showed. Basically, it's a little small enclave of 7 homes. It's on a hillside, so there are no homes below. There are not homes close above. There's a barricade at night, and the Japanese garden sits right next to the park. It makes the street a dead end. That makes it no eyes on the street at night, no traffic coming and going, and there's been more crime in that part of the neighborhood. We did some studies of our board members versus the folks living directly across. They had 6 times the number of incidents of tire slashing, cars keying, mischief, painting, on, versus 1 in 3 for the board members in our neighborhood. Some of us live next to the park, some of us live inside the neighborhood, but there's significantly more crime down there, even versus other people who live next to the park. Promises were made. They promised us that they would limit it to a 10-year term based on the estimate of 3 years to start their campaign, another 5 years from the campaign to the end of construction, and then 2 years to spare. That's what they told us. We had a good neighbor agreement where everybody said the intent of the parties is that the Kingston House be used for residential purposes after 10 years. And the hearings officer noted in that 2009 hearing that the applicants and said the proposal would only be acceptable if the applicant was limited to the extent possible to a 10-year term. Thereafter, the house be returned to residential use. That's what this is about. The promises were broken. They didn't wait very long. In 2013, Steve Bloom mentioned that at the Neighborhood Association meeting that it's the garden's intent to maintain permanent offices in the residence they own on Kingston. This is contrary, we said, this is contrary to what we were led to believe during negotiations regarding their conditional use permit for the residents a few years back. In the 2014 decision, The Japanese Garden sought to expand the Kingston House and make it permanent. When the neighborhood objected to that, they withdrew that. And then they added additional, many extra feet to the cultural village to accommodate administrative staff. Then in 2017, the construction was complete, and now the Kingston House is still an office. We've had many livability impacts in our neighborhood, and that's kind of the crux of the argument here. There's more crime. There's more crime all over the city. The police are doing their best. They're spread thin. The city's grown significantly. The visitors to the Japanese Gardens have grown significantly. There are two major construction projects. An administrative office in our neighborhood is yet one more, particularly to those people that live next to it. I mentioned the vandalism is higher. Traffic and parking, our homes don't have garages, or they have very small garages, so we're on the street. Metered parking means people park in the neighborhood, and the garden park employees have been regularly parking in the neighborhood. They only began enforcing the Good Neighbor Agreement shortly before they approached us for a 10-year extension. 12 additional parked cars for one home on streets close to capacity has an impact.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Wait, if I could just say one more.
No, ma'am, you cannot. Your time's up.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank
He
you.
runs a tight ship.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. Opponents of the appeal?
I have 3 people signed up.
3 people signed up. They will have 3 minutes each.
Christy Wuddig, Colleen Shoemaker, and Jay Shoemaker.
Is the third person in the chamber?
Yes, she's right there.
Please come on up and go ahead and start.
My name is Christy Wuddig, and I am a resident in Arlington Heights. I am here to read a letter from Marshall Gannett, who could not be here tonight in person, or today.
Yes, okay.
It feels like tonight.
This is testimony in support of the hearing officer's decision and opposition to the appeal, January 30th, 2020. Dear members of the council, contrary to the Japanese Gardens appeal, the hearing officer did not err in limiting the Japanese Gardens' use of a residence, the Kingston House, for an administrative office to 4 years. This was a compromise between the 10 years in their original request and the 2 years the Arlington Heights neighborhood asked for. The Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association agreed not to oppose the original 2009 request for a 10-year variance of zoning laws so the Japanese Garden could use a residence for administrative offices based on a promise by the Japanese Garden that such use was temporary. They told the neighborhood that their new construction would include ample office space and they would return the home to their residential use when construction was complete. This was codified in the Good Neighbor Agreement. In 2014, when the Japanese Gardens land use application for their expansion was first made public, they tried to include permanent use of the Kingston House. Their true objective and their deceit was out in the open. The use of the Kingston House was removed from their land use application in response to serious objections of the neighborhood. At this point, the Japanese Garden made a conscious decision not to include adequate administrative space in their new construction. Either they did not consider it important, or they figured they would eventually get the city to roll over. This decision has real consequences to city residents and the neighborhood. As mentioned in my original testimony regarding the decision in question, by insisting on having their administrative staff on site for their convenience, the Japanese Garden exacerbates existing parking and congestion problems in the neighborhood. Moreover, the small amount of free parking in Washington Park within walking distance of the Rose Garden on Kingston Drive has, in fact, become the Japanese Garden's ad hoc employee parking lot. And because of this, is commonly filled to capacity. During morning runs, I've witnessed car after car parked there and occupants walking to the Japanese Garden's back gate. This parking is for park visitors, right? It is fitting that the Japanese Garden's bi-monthly newsletter is titled The Garden Path because they have led the neighborhood and the city down the garden path time again and again. Please uphold the hearing officer's well-reasoned decision and reject the appeal.
Excellent, thank you.
Marshall Gannett.
Next. Please, one of you.
Yes, all right. I'm Colleen Shoemaker, and I am on the board of Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association, and I thank you all for taking the time with this today. I support and indeed cherish the Japanese garden, and I'm a member and a frequent visitor, and I hope to be a future volunteer there. But I ask council to uphold the hearing officer's November 2019 land use decision to limit the conditional use exception for the Kingston House to 4 years. Poet Robert Frost's words come to mind, quote, "Good fences make good neighbors," end quote. We ask council to keep our esteemed neighbor on its side of the zoning fence. All three conditional use decisions in 2009, 14, and 2019 clearly state this exception in our R7 zone is understood by all parties to be temporary. Yet the record shows the Japanese garden has intended repeatedly since 2008 to make the exception permanent. The hearings officer says in 2019, quote, "If council approves the applicant's request for a 10-year extension, then the council would effectively be making the office use of the Kingston House permanent," end quote. A 10-year extension makes this exception to zoning de facto permanent, and to grant this extension sets precedents that undermine Portland zoning laws. A council decision to overturn the hearings officer decision could suggest that spot zoning is acceptable in Portland. Spot zoning is that can be defined as an unjustified exception within a district that benefits a particular property owner to the detriment of general land use, public goals, and undermines the pre-existing rights and uses of neighbors. As I testified on October 30th, any nonprofit or business could then expect this exception, and extensions of conditional use will be hard to deny to anyone. Conditional use becomes permanent use and de facto changes zonings. A 4-year extension is generous time for the garden to find offices, and it also preserves our zoning and reaffirms the boundaries that help us maintain livability as our neighborhood faces the challenges of being neighbors to the city's most popular visitor attractions. I thank you, council, for hearing our concerns and protecting the integrity of our neighborhoods. And I'm also going to take the additional 30 seconds allowed to continue Kathy's presentation. She asks that you affirm the decision, and she'd like you to add a condition that the Japanese garden report annually to the Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association and the City of Portland on their progress for finding new office space outside the park. Thank you.
Well done, you got it into that time period.
She's good. I'll vouch for it. I'm Jay Shoemaker, 2770 Southwest Rutland Terrace. I'm here in my capacity as a resident and as an architect registered in the state of Oregon. In 17th of September 2014, City Council approved the Japanese Gardens expansion plan. It's document LU 14122172. It's an attachment to the findings. In the purpose section of the plan, the garden identified 8,890 square feet for an administrative office. That's already been referred to today. The second floor of which, they said, is for offices. Appreciate the comment made that that has been turned into public space, but there is generous public space available there, and this is a programmatic need that they made a commitment to achieve. What is interesting here is this discussion pens around 12 people, 2,200 square feet. Not many, not large. May require the reallocation of space, possibly even public space for the purposes of office, or, as they've already been said by others, need to put those elsewhere. The key point I want to stress here is the possibility or process that the City of Portland will have a plan to put offices in a highly congested, highly valued public park is very suspicious or suspect. There has nothing been in the plan, and when the plan was developed, nothing that surfaced or remains in terms of providing offices. And if those offices were provided, they very likely would not meet one of the fundamental criteria that Japanese Garden has stated, and that is walkability, being adjacent. The area of the Japanese garden is shown in the 2018 plan to have many potential changes, all of which serve congestion and public service aspects and not the service of any institution. In other words, that area has already been examined, and nothing in the vicinity of it or the Japanese garden could possibly, within walking distance, provide the officing requirements that have been referred to. At this particular point, I simply end by saying I'd like to support the findings of the hearing officer and limit this to 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Any questions? Hearing none, thank you very much. We will now hear from a rebuttal by the appellant, and you will have 5 minutes for that rebuttal.
Hi, thank you. Kelly Hosseini with Miller Nash, 111 Southwest Fifth Avenue, Portland, 97204. I represent the Japanese Garden. I first want to object to the two exhibits that were attached to the Neighborhood Association's January 30th letter. They also, I believe, were in the PowerPoint. They are new evidence that is not in the record. I also want to answer Commissioner Udaley's question. You asked staff what the adverse impacts were that were identified by the hearings officer, and I can tell you that I read that decision a number of times and I couldn't find any. The hearings officer never actually identified any adverse impacts, much less significant adverse impacts that were noise, glare from lights, late-night operations, odors and litter, privacy and safety issues. The approval criterion, as I noted, is pretty clear as to what it asks for, and the hearings officer did not, his decision was not consistent with that. With respect to crime, the neighborhood associations stated that crime has increased in its neighborhood over the last 10 years. The hearings officer did not dispute that. What he said, however, is that there is no evidence of a causal link between that increase in crime and the use of the Kingston House as an office. And he's correct. There is no causal link. Crime has increased in my Portland neighborhood too, but I live 5 miles away from the Kingston House. So, I can't attribute that to the Kingston House. The garden has security patrols 24/7, 2 times a night. They go around, they look at that house, they make sure everything's okay. I would note that the house next to the Kingston House has not been occupied for some years, actually. It stood vacant. And I would also note that the neighbor next door to the vacant house, so just 2 houses over from the garden office space, has said that they showed up to the hearing and they submitted testimony and said there's been no crime increase that they've noticed. And they would know because they are really quite close. I also just want to note that the commercial delivery trucks breaking mature tree limbs as part of making deliveries to the Kingston House. There are no commercial deliveries to the Kingston House. Everything goes to the garden. So if some trucks are breaking limbs, I don't know what that's all about, but it has nothing to do with the house. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Christie, because I've taken exactly half of the time.
Nice. It's Lisa Christie. I'm with Portland Japanese Garden, and I just wanted to address a couple of the points brought up here today. Specifically, Mr. Janik mentioned that the garden has been focused on looking for office space in Washington Park, and I think a lot of people have asked, why don't you just find office space somewhere else? And I just want to bring up the idea that, we have been focused on Washington Park because what we're trying to do is serve the people who sit in that house, serve the garden, and are up at the garden every day. And so if we were to go find an office space out in downtown somewhere, we're now exacerbating the problems of traffic, parking issues coming into Washington Park. So those employees who are in the house are serving the garden, and they're there every day, which is not duplicative of the Sylvan space that Mr. Janik also mentioned. Yes, we do have office space up at Sylvan because, yes, we do have more needs for more space. But for those who don't have to be at the garden every day or even very often, they can have office space up there at Sylvan, so we have that. Those functions are not duplicative of the people who sit in the Kingston House. And so I just wanted to clarify that point. And then lastly, I just wanted to reiterate Steve Bloom's point that he made earlier, that while, ideally the expansion would have handled office space needs, our intent was that it would have handled office space needs. When we got there in the planning process, throughout the planning process, and even throughout the whole architectural process, when we found the hilly topography, when we found the structural issues of the hillside, it was not possible. And yes, there is some office space up there in the buildings. It's not much. We kept it pretty limited because, as Steve mentioned, we wanted to reserve, we made the deliberate choice to reserve as much space as possible up there by the garden for the garden and for programming that helps enhance all the public who comes to visit and what their experience would be like. Thank you.
And we believe we meet the criteria as a permanent use. 10 years is an accommodation to the neighbors.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Fritz.
Question for you. Would you
Please.
like to address the hearings officer's finding regarding Goal 10, the statewide planning goal, regarding the availability of necessary housing?
Yeah, again, he didn't really explain very well what the problem would be with making this permanent. He kind of started with the premise that this thing needed to be temporary to be able to meet any number of these approval criteria, and then never really explained what one had to do with the other. And I don't think that one house, one single-family home being used as an office really impacts citywide whether or not you have enough housing inventory. And frankly, what I would point you to is the fact that 10 years ago, there was some concern, well, is this just the camel's nose under the tent? Are there going to be a bunch more office uses in the neighborhood? And there are no other office uses in the neighborhood. It remains this office. Thank you. And that's it.
Thank you. Legal counsel, we are told that there were items presented that were not part of the original record. Is that accurate?
Let me discuss those with you and my analysis of them, and then council gets to decide what to do. So the January 30th letter from the Neighborhood Association and an associated PowerPoint presentation included two exhibits. One of the items, Exhibit 1, was an aerial photo. That aerial photo was in the record, but there were markings on that photo that were new. In the interest of being conservative, I would not include that in the record simply because I think that information is contained in other testimony. I think it's fine to reject that. There's also a chart and a map that also were new information, and I would also recommend not including those in the record. I think that some of the substance of that information can be found in other testimony, but it wasn't presented in that form. I'm going to also identify that in the testimony from the CEO of the garden, he mentioned some information about wages and health insurance. Staff does not believe that information was previously in the record, so council should not consider that in its decision and reject that. But
Excellent, thank you. Colleagues, we have three options. We are now going to deliberate on and decide what our three options are. And for the record, I will say that we can either agree with the hearings officer's recommendation. We could modify and vote to affirm that. That's number one. Number two, we could vote to change the hearings officer's recommendation and vote today to do that. Or we could not vote at all. We need 3 affirmative votes, so depending upon how we feel, if we don't get to 3 affirmative votes, then we will have to carry it over to another day, but there would be no additional testimony. It would just be on a day where we had more than 3 of us present for the vote.
correct. And I would also add, and you may have been about to do this, Commissioner Fritz, that I would recommend that whatever you do today would be a tentative vote with
And
coming
then
back with
reaffirm
findings.
it when
Yeah.
we have a larger presence.
even
Excellent.
without the three of you, because of the testimony today, it would be worthwhile to amend the findings to bolster the reasoning and make sure we've addressed the procedural issues, including the record items.
Excellent, thank you. So colleagues.
Madam President?
Yes, please.
Thank you all for being here today. I should have stated at the beginning that I visited with the Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association last year about the Bull Run and about the Water Bureau's charter measures. You were so gracious to me, and I really appreciate your help in passing those measures. That said, unfortunately, I don't agree with your rationale. We are required to make the decision based on the approval criteria. There is nothing in the approval criteria about is it a temporary use. Conditional uses often don't have any time limits on them at all. There's nothing in the approval criteria about exploring other locations. This is the hearings officer found that this office use as an accessory to the garden is an allowed use in the R7 zone with a conditional use approval. The hearings officer did not list any impacts to the residential area, as was claimed. In fact, the hearings officer did find, as was just mentioned, that there's no evidence to suggest that the crime is related to the office. So the whole hearings officer decision seems to be based on that the resident, this is on page 24, the residential area is unique and particularly sensitive to any adverse impacts created by a non-residential use, such as the operation of administrative offices. But then same paragraph, across the street from the Kingston House are public tennis courts, and adjacent to the Kingston House is a parking lot. All of these adjacent uses generate activity in the residential area and contribute to the character and the nature of the residential area, which seems to me to be calling out that there's a lot of activity. In fact, there's evidence in the record regarding the traffic and the volume on Kingston. The average volume was 2,513 motor vehicles. So the impact of the 12 employees arriving there, parking and leaving, it's not credible to me. And then the finding on goal 10, that we have to have enough needed housing within the city's comprehensive plan. It's probably not in the record how many hundreds of thousands of units we have, so I won't state that. But we know that we're working on various ways of increasing housing capacity in the city. So losing one house or having it continue as a temporary use for the office use, having an impact on the overall city ability to provide housing just is not credible. So for all these reasons, unless anybody, the final thing that was in the appeal statements, which was not really highlighted a little bit, but the hearings officer, this is on page 29, the hearings officer finds that the residential area in this case is unique and that any additional or different noise, glare, lights, late night operations, odors, litter, etc., do adversely impact the livability of the residential area, despite, under each of the criterion, saying that there aren't significant noise, lights, late night operations, etc. So I just don't understand how the hearings officer came to this conclusion, except that there apparently was a deal made and then there was another deal and this doesn't comport with the deal, but that's not what the approval criteria are. We can only make our decision based on what does the code require, and the code, it doesn't seem to me that this, that the 4-year extension is in response to the approval criteria. So with that in mind, I move that we tentatively uphold the appeal and allow the use to continue I would actually allow it to continue to be used until anybody shows that the conditional use is criteria not met, but that's not what we're being asked to do. So extend the use for 10 years and adjust the findings accordingly.
Second.
There's been a motion and a second. We'll continue dialogue. Commissioner Udalli, do you want to weigh in on a deliberation?
I'll just say that I really appreciate Commissioner Fritz right now. I am not feeling well, and not tracking quite as closely as she is, but I agree. I was surprised and disappointed to hear the garden's actions characterized as deceitful. I reject the assertion that the use of the house as an administrative office is creating more crime. This house is set so back far from the roadway. Even if there was a residential occupant, they would not be eyes on the street unless they, I guess, put a lawn chair on the sidewalk. So very happy to support this motion.
So we're not going to be able to conclude this today because I do not agree with the direction that Commissioner Fritz is recommending. I believe that when you work out a negotiated deal that says in 10 years, you're going to actually do something different, at the end of that 10 years, then blame the Parks Bureau or blame that we didn't know we needed a bigger building or blame inaction of other people, I find that disingenuous. And so I would come down on the side of absolutely supporting the hearings officer's recommendation with the maximum of 4 years additional. I do believe that the Chinese Garden needs some motivation to actually figure out what they're going to do for office space. And I think 10 years is a long time for someone to figure out how to address their office needs. And I know that the Parks Bureau is not in conversations with anyone about building office space for anybody, including themselves. And so it just feels like that was a misrepresentation of the opportunities with the Parks Bureau, which is suffering their own budget deficits and has been for quite some time. And I've heard nothing about bond measures being put forward to partner with Japanese Garden or any other organization. And so if there was going to, I guess we do have a motion on the floor. So
You could just continue it.
we will, I could table it until we come back. Is that an appropriate motion?
Yes, if everyone concurs in that, you can
If
do
my
that
colleagues
and bring it back.
concur, so I think it's clear about where the three of us stand. I guess the thing is that we need a 3 vote either way. Can you tell the audience what happens when we have a limited city council if we don't end up with 3 people agreeing with a recommendation?
Today, because we only have 3 of you.
Oh, no, I mean, when we come
have
back,
4,
right? So
the answer is we have to have 3. And so I think what we would probably have you do is figure out, the group would have to make motions until you figure out a way that you can all be, at
The
least
three of
3 of
us
you could
could-
be on the same page.
well, in that case, we have completed our work for today. We will table, no,
So what we need to do is, so that we don't have to notice this again, we need to come up with a time and date certain to return when we know that all 4 members of the council will be here. And obviously making sure we give enough time for the mayor to review the proceedings.
Carla, can you give us a date where we are pretty sure we'll have 4 of us here?
It's either next week, which would be February 5th, 6th, or the following week, the 12th, 13th. And then because Commissioner Fritz is out for 2 weeks, we'll be looking at March 4th.
Why don't we do the 12th or 13th? Any preference?
I will say this, I think that it would be, the record is short enough that if all 4 of you are here next week, I don't see a problem with that. When we're doing findings, we need a little more of a break, but not for just.
Well, I want to be respectful that the mayor may need to review the tape and then we may need to have some conversation. So I just don't want to rush it to the vote if we.
No conversation.
Let's
We're not
make
allowed
sure,
to
this
have
is a quasi
conversations.
judicial, so we should make sure that the conversations are on the record, please.
Yes, yes. Yes, absolutely. Okay, what date?
So we're talking about the 12th then? I'm sorry.
12th works for
The
me.
12th, we'll do, we're packed here. I have 11 a.m. Do you know how much time we might need? Maybe I can,
I would suspect no more than a half hour.
okay, let's go with 11 a.m. because we were RIP in the afternoon and I don't have a time estimate on that, so.
All right.
Okay.
11 a.m. it is?
Yes.
And that is on the 12th?
February 12th, yes, 11 a.m. time certain.
And before I adjourn, I just want to thank you all for being here. We greatly appreciate you putting your information on the record. And on that note, we are officially adjourned. Thank you.